Chapter 2351. Perhaps it was because of this that Li Fengmu felt so helpless in his heart. The world was unpredictable, and no one could predict the future. There's no need to rush. We won't wait until Mu Yang breaks through to level 3 Martial Emperor before making a decision. Li Fengmu hesitated for a long time before voicing his thoughts. If Mu Yang could really break through to level 3 Martial Emperor, his growth would allow the entire drifting cloud boundary to breathe a sigh of relief. At that time, the number of level 3 Martial Emperors would not change. This seemed to be the best outcome. Luo Ji kept his mouth shut when he heard this. He did not know how to bring up this matter and could only leave it to them to decide. The Duke of Qin also frowned. He felt that this matter was not something that could be decided based on friendship alone. However, looking at Li Fengmu's current attitude, he seemed to have steeled his heart and was prepared to continue waiting. Since Sword Master Li has already made a decision, it's not good for us to persuade him. Sword Master Li, please make arrangements over there. It's best to expand the range of the spies to prevent us from being too late. Qin Wang made a prompt decision. Since the situation was already like this, there was no point in them continuing to be entangled in this matter. Hence, taking a step back was the best choice. Furthermore, Qin Wang felt that this was a setup that could be used for the final battle with the White Bear tribe. As long as they waited for Xiao Yang to return alive, this plan could naturally be carried out. As for when exactly it would be carried out, it was hard to say. This old man still understands this point. However, I don't know how Princess Mingzhu and Xiao Yang are doing. Li Fengmu sighed helplessly as he spoke. It could be said that in this war he had seen too many geniuses being defeated by the general trend of the war. Even his favorite disciple, Bai Jian, was unable to recover from the setback because he failed to break through to level 3 Martial Emperor. Although Bai Jian was able to pull himself together, whether he could walk out of the Sword Scar Abyss was a huge problem. The Sword Scar Abyss was like a nightmare to the cultivators of the Sky Sword Mountain. It could be said that before the Sword Scar Abyss, no one had been able to walk out of it in one piece. Some of them walked out, but because their Dao hearts were injured, they ended up being stuck in a stalemate. Thinking of these things, Li Fengmu couldn't help but feel a headache. In fact, they had already predicted the worst outcome, but they were unwilling to accept it. It was also because of this that they stayed here for such a long time, in order to protect that person's world. It could be said that if Xiao Yang had not decisively dragged Bai Xingyun into the strange space, the Triumph Mountain would have fallen in the battle that day. In fact, there might even be more chain reactions. After more than 10 days, Xiao Yang still hadn't shown himself. They were well aware of exactly what had happened during this period of time. However, they still harbored a glimmer of hope. However, whether or not this glimmer of hope could bring about a new dawn had become an unsolved mystery. Our luck is really bad. The place where we came from actually has a vicious neighbor. Li Fengmu somewhat helplessly mocked himself. So many things had happened, and they were also very helpless. However, if they wanted their world to continue on, they had no other choice but to continue onwards. All of a sudden, the three of them were shocked. They looked up and saw that there was already a place where flames were soaring into the sky. The corner of Li Fengmu's mouth twitched. He had said that he would leave after Mu Yang broke through, but he didn't expect it to happen so quickly. "Looks like this is the will of the heavens, Sword Master Li," Luo Ji said with a smile. Qin Wang nodded in agreement and said, "Sword Master Li, why don't you tell me to leave after I reach Class 4? Li Fengmu could not help but laugh in the face of such ridicule. Perhaps this was the will of the heavens, and no one could go against it. Li Fengmu would be at ease if he could return as soon as possible. Everyone's expression suddenly turned grave as they looked at the flames that soared into the sky. This was because they felt that the phenomenon created by Mu Yang was a little too exaggerated. The flowing cloud realm is indeed a place of hidden dragons and crouching tigers. I remember that when Mu Yang was in the small world, he had only just reached the peak. I didn't expect him to reach Class 3 Martial King, so quickly. This speed is so fast that it makes me feel ashamed. Luo Ji muttered with some self-mockery. Li Fengmu was stunned for a moment. Soon after, he came back to his senses and bitterly laughed in a helpless manner. If that was the case, Mu Yang's progress was really fast. It could even be said that he was the fastest. After stepping into the middle world, which King Wu's progress could compare to Mu Yang's, the gap between them could be said to be very clear. Once Mu Yang stepped into Class 3 Martial King, he would become a core figure even in the Four-Realm Alliance. Currently, the number of Class 3 Almighties in the Four-Realm Alliance could be counted on one hand. I really don't know what kind of strange place the Flowing Cloud Realm is. It was previously at the bottom of the 3,000 small worlds. However, its rise this time is really incomprehensible. Luo Ji continued. Qin Wang smiled and said, "It's just a matter of accumulating strength. Besides, don't you know what that person is capable of? I've seen it before. The 3 extra places in the Flowing Cloud Realm were all brought here by him." Immediately, everyone came back to their senses and smiled. The change in the Flowing Cloud Realm was indeed caused by Xiaoyang's rise. Now, they were even more curious about what kind of person Xiaoyang was. How powerful were his methods to be able to reach the pinnacle of every place? Even though there was a huge gap in the overall strength of the Flowing Cloud Realm, it had never been at a disadvantage in terms of peak strength. This strange phenomenon lasted for the time it took for an incense stick to burn before it dissipated. The aura was also revealed. This meant that Mu Yang had succeeded. This news boosted the morale of the Pine Victory Mountain again. For the Flowing Cloud Realm to have another Class 3 Martial King expert, this meant a lot to them. The breakthrough this time was also a glimmer of hope. Everything went well. Then, this old man will take his leave. Please take care of this place. Li Fengmu cupped his fists and smiled. Sword Masterly, why are you in such a hurry? How can the final battle be without you? At this moment, a familiar voice sounded, shocking everyone. Chapter 2352. In West Wind City, after more than 10 days, the White Bear Army could no longer suppress their emotions. Bai Cheng's injuries had almost fully recovered, so it would be unreasonable if he did not make a move. By then, it would be difficult to convince the masses. Therefore, he had no choice but to provoke another battle. Moreover, it could not be a small battle. It would be best if they could take down Taste Victory Mountain in one fell swoop and directly take over the drifting cloud boundary. Almost all the higher-ups had gathered in this place again, and everyone had different thoughts and speculations. However, no matter how many thoughts they had, they still had to listen to Bai Cheng's orders in the end. Bai Cheng was still in a difficult position, but the pressure forced him to continue moving forward. Bai Xingyun's life and death were unknown, and there was no news at all. This made him very helpless and worried. Ancestor, since things have come to this, why don't we just retreat to the Myriad Beast realm? Why don't we fight with all our strength and take down the drifting cloud boundary as our foundation? An old man with white hair and beard said with a bitter smile. This old man had advised them countless times, and his attitude was very firm. He wanted to be the main force and fight with his own integrity. Sometimes there was no point in worrying too much. The last retreat was only because they were not prepared enough. This time, as long as they arranged every detail and exerted every bit of strength to the extreme, would they still need to worry about not being able to take down the drifting cloud boundary? Their previous failure was only because they didn't make enough arrangements. If they could arrange everything well, why would it be like this? Ancestor, this is indeed the case. Please reconsider. If we wait any longer, once the morale is completely destroyed, it will be difficult for us to make a comeback, the middle-aged man said. Bai Cheng nodded. He was naturally clear about the pros and cons. In particular, some news from the Myriad Beast realm made him even more restless. As for Bai Xingyun's current situation, it did not seem to be something he could worry about now. It seems that everyone is full of fighting spirit. With such great morale, it seems that we will definitely win this time, Bai Cheng said with a smile. Due to some unforeseen events last time, their morale had indeed suffered a big blow. However, this time they had to solve all these problems. As long as there were no more problems, everything would be easy to handle. Ancestor, you just have to give the order. This time, if we don't take down the lower grade Victory Mountain, then we will never withdraw. A young man said even more fervently. Bai Cheng smiled and nodded. Now he had also made up his mind. He didn't have much time left. If he didn't make a move now, the voices from the myriad beast realm would become louder and louder. At that time, it would be impossible for them to swallow the majority of the resources. Since they had paid such a high price, they naturally had to take the lion's share. Otherwise, this deal would really make them lose so much that even their pants would be gone. This time we will split up and fight. I want to see just how powerful the alliance of these 4 small worlds is. Bai Cheng snorted coldly. During this period of time, they were also very depressed. Everyone became excited when they heard this. The final battle was finally about to begin. Moreover, they also firmly believed that in this battle, as long as the arrangements were reasonable, they could easily take down the flowing cloud world. The reason why they retreated previously was because they underestimated the enemy too much and used a completely brainless method to fight. That was why they ended up retreating. Then, once they split up, the flowing cloud world would be too tired to deal with it. At that time, even if the lower grade Victory Mountain could hold on, it would probably become an isolated island in the end. If they split up and rushed out to help, then this only barrier would be broken. Therefore, for the flowing cloud world that lacked top experts, it would be difficult to deal with. After Li Fengmu and the others heard this familiar voice, they all looked up and saw a young man in a black robe slowly walking over. They all tried to sense the young man's aura, but in the end, they all returned without success. Because that robe was very magical, it completely concealed his aura. However, when they saw that person's face, they all became extremely excited. The worst-case scenario in their hearts had suddenly become the best scenario. It turned out that the young man had been creating miracles all along. Bai Xingyun. As the Qin Emperor spoke, he couldn't help but stutter. All of this happened too quickly, and he couldn't react in time. Dead. The black-robed young man smiled faintly and answered crisply. As soon as this was said, the Qin Emperor Luo Ji and the others were all shocked. This was because they never thought that Xiaoyang really did it. He turned the situation around with his own strength and even killed Bai Xingyun. Bai Xingyun, the almighty half-step to rank 5, was gone. Then, what else could the White Bear tribe use to resist Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu's attacks? Therefore, the outcome of this battle had begun to become clear in their eyes. All the problems seemed to have been completely eliminated. Haha, you brat, you're really amazing. Qin Wang also laughed heartily. Now, there were some changes in his eyes. Back then, the Qin Emperor was still a little unwilling to lose to Xiaoyang. But now, it could be said that he was completely convinced. With the ability of a rank 2 martial emperor, he could defeat a half-step to rank 5 powerhouse. One could only imagine how terrifying this strength was. The Qin Emperor even thought that under the premise that he had suppressed Xiaoyang by a rank, he had a chance to defeat him and regain his dignity. But now, it seemed that it was just his own imagination. Why did you keep quiet for so long? Luo Ji asked with some doubt. On top of that, Xiaoyang was still able to conceal his aura. This was a big problem. Xiaoyang shook his head helplessly and said, I did this to not alert the enemy. Moreover, although I killed Bai Xingyun, I was also severely injured. So I had no choice but to do this. Luo Ji and the Qin Emperor nodded in succession. If that was the case, then it made sense. However, they were still very shocked in their hearts. Xiaoyang was actually able to recover from such a serious injury in such a short time. This was also somewhat unbelievable. Now, we don't have much time left. I think the enemy must have set off from West Wind City. so we must make arrangements in a short time." At this time, Xiao Yang's expression became serious. Li Fengmu and the others immediately gathered their thoughts and waited for the order. Chapter 2353. Spring Sun City quietly sent out a team. This team wasn't very big, only consisting of a few people. However, there was no need to doubt the battle prowess of this team. It was extremely tyrannical. The leader was called by Li Wei, and he was a third-level martial emperor. Moreover, among the 8 people he brought this time, 2 of them were early-stage martial emperors, while the remaining 6 were at the peak of King Wu. With such a strong team, as long as they did not encounter a tough opponent, they could do whatever they wanted. This time, the mission that Bai Liwei received was very simple. It was to charge straight to the Extreme Yang sect's hometown, take down the Extreme Yang sect, and then march into Northern Light City. This way, they would cut off the resources and supplies of Pin Victory Mountain. It could be said that this method was very ruthless. As long as the opponent's supplies were cut off, the war would be difficult to continue due to the lack of supplies. Of course, this was only a superficial level because this time there were still quite a few teams that were split into teams. The goal of each team was different, but the goal was to march in from different places and then take down the entire Flowing Light Realm. In the end, the result was very simple. It was to turn the Metal Victory Mountain into an isolated island. Of course, in the case of the Flowing Cloud Realm falling completely, no matter how strong the defenders on Pin Victory Mountain were, they would probably lose their souls because of this. At that time, they could besiege Pin Victory Mountain and take it down in one fell swoop. This was also the safest method that Bai Chang and the other Almighties had come up with after discussing. Since Bai Xingyun, the top battle strength, was not there, they had to think of other reliable methods. Only in this way could they minimize the losses as much as possible. Perhaps to them, this was no longer important. What was important was whether or not they could obtain victory in this war. What they needed was a complete victory. This kind of thing seemed to be completely achievable on paper, but war was sometimes so cruel. This was not a matter of strength on paper. A single mistake under any command could lead to a complete loss. Therefore, they had pondered over this plan for a long time before coming up with it. It could even be said to be a flawless existence. Even if one's personal strength was formidable, or if one had an exquisite formation, what was the use? The overall situation is there, and you will never be able to change it. However, Bai Liwei still felt a little uncomfortable in his heart. He felt that he was a dignified third-stage martial monarch, yet he still had to do such a sneaky thing. This was truly difficult for him to accept. He should have killed more martial emperors in a frontal battle to add to his list of achievements. However, if he did this, the benefits he could obtain would be greatly reduced. However, because this was the result of everyone's discussion and ancestor by Cheng's decision, no matter how unhappy he was, he could only suppress it for the time being. In fact, in Bai Liwei's opinion, this could be said to be the Bai family's narrow-mindedness. They were doing this in order to suppress the Bailey family. However, no matter how unhappy and displeased he was, Bai Liwei had no choice but to remain silent and do as they instructed, even though he was displeased in his heart. So what? In the face of the interests of the entire race, even if the other party was using an overt scheme, he could only silently accept it, not daring to disobey. Otherwise, he did not think that he had the ability to withstand a huge accusation. Therefore, sometimes it was fine to swallow the insult and humiliation. A little impatience would spoil great plans. Sometimes it was fine to keep a low profile. However, after walking for a short distance, Bai Liwei suddenly saw a black figure attacking him. That black silhouette was holding a sword in its hand. The sword looked very strange. It was half lightning and half fire. However, in the blink of an eye, Bai Liwei saw the black robe clearly. Isn't that Bai Wuxi's black robe? When this thought appeared in Bai Liwei's mind, he was instantly stunned. Everyone knew that Bai Wuxi had died at the hands of Xiaoyang. In that case, the question of whose hands the robe would end up in was obvious. After thinking about this, Bai Liwei's heart was almost filled with despair. How was this possible? He really couldn't figure out why such an unforeseen event would occur. Shouldn't Xiaoyang have died at the hands of Bai Xingyan? What was going on with his sudden appearance now? Bai Liwei did not have time to figure out the key points. He could only immediately revert to his original form to deal with the situation. However, his speed was too slow. Or rather, Xiaoyang's sword was too fast. A sword light flashed, and a bloody wound began to appear on Bai Liwei's body. Bai Liwei lowered his head in disbelief and looked at the bloody wound on his chest. He really could not understand. His opponent was one level lower than him, so how could he kill him as easily as cutting grass? Moreover, Xiaoyang was clearly here to ambush him. How did he know his whereabouts? Impossible! Bai Liwei yelled in a trembling voice. Bai Liwei did not believe that Bai Cheng had colluded with Xiaoyang to deal with the Bai Liwei tribe. However, everything that had happened now made people think more about it. How could Xiaoyang know so clearly what he was thinking? Only those who had participated in the plan would be able to get such accurate information. Although the conflict between the Bai tribe and the Bai tribe had never stopped, there was no need for them to fall out with each other in front of such a big issue. Bai Liwei's first thought was to escape immediately. However, as he turned around, his body fell to the ground and he could not move. He had been cut in half at the waist by the sword. All of this happened too quickly. The people that followed were all flabbergasted. Some of them had not recovered from the shock and did not understand what had happened. Even their eyes were glazed over. In the blink of an eye, everything had changed. At that moment, Bai Liwei's spiritual soul immediately left his body. For a martial royal realm powerhouse, he could rely on his spiritual soul to be reborn. As long as he was alive, he would have a chance in the future. Therefore, how could he bear to miss such a great opportunity? However, how could Xiaoyang let go of such a potential threat? With another slash, he directly split Bai Liwei's divine soul into two halves. Everything had happened as fast as the wind, catching everyone off guard. Bai Liwei could not accept it. How did it happen so quickly? Chapter 2354. The remaining warriors were even more dumbfounded. They couldn't even comprehend what was going on. How did Bai Liwei, their leader, end up with his soul destroyed in such a short time? Even if Bai Liwei was the weakest rank 3 warrior in the White Bear tribe, he should not have been killed in an instant. Bai Liwei was a rank 3 warrior. Wasn't it a little too fast for him to be killed? However, they did not know the mystery behind this. Xiaoyang had been waiting for a long time and had controlled every detail to the extreme. He had even secretly used the power of the world to completely suppress Bai Liwei. Such an ambush was naturally a success. After killing Bai Liwei, Xiaoyang immediately turned around and charged towards the rest of the people. Run! One of the martial emperors roared angrily. Even Bai Liwei, who was a third-order martial emperor, could not withstand a single blow from Xiaoyang's sword. With their cultivation, how could they possibly have the confidence to challenge him? Hence, the only thing they could do now was to escape from this place and spread all the information they knew so that the army in front of them would know that an unforeseen event had occurred in this long-planned battle. An unexpected change had occurred. However, the martial emperor had just finished his sentence when his head flew off in the next moment. Xiaoyang did not care about what they said. He waved the divine sword in his hand wantonly and began to reap their lives. Xiaoyang had put on a black robe for this operation. He wanted to carry out all of this in secret. Hence, he was determined not to let anyone leave. If even one person left this place, then his whereabouts would be completely exposed. By then, all of their plans would be in vain. If they faced the enemy head-on, their losses would be much greater. It could be said that in this battle, both sides had the same tacit understanding, which was to minimize their losses. Furthermore, they were not willing to let go of any possibility. As long as they could do it, it was enough. In less than half a cup of tea's time, this small group of people had all fallen. Even their spirits had been destroyed, making it difficult for them to send messages. Xiao Yang shook the divine sword in his hand, causing blood to drip down. A sinister smile appeared on his face. I could have ambushed and killed him if I came early. I don't know if I will have such a good opportunity in the next battle. Xiao Yang helplessly laughed bitterly. Immediately, he changed his direction and quickly sneaked away. This time he was able to kill Bai Liwei because he had made all the preparations. He was able to catch Bai Liwei off guard and directly kill him. However, because of this, they were delayed for some time. When the next team caught up, they probably wouldn't have enough time to kill him. They could only fight him head-on. Although Xiao Yang wasn't afraid of a head-on battle, he couldn't help but be cautious. After all, time was scarce. As for how long Pin Victory Mountain could hold on, it was still an unknown. No one could say for sure. Therefore, Xiao Yang had to quicken his pace. A blitzkrieg battle that ended quickly was what he needed to do. Once these henchmen were eliminated, they would be able to concentrate their strength on Taste Victory Mountain and once again compete with Bai Cheng. Bai Cheng led the army forward slowly. He wasn't in a hurry. After all, he still needed to wait for the other small groups to attack before launching an attack. Their attack this time was divided into the main force and the surprise attack. No matter which side it was, they needed to cooperate with each other. Only in this way could they display their greatest advantage. The involvement between each other was also very important. When the time came, the drifting Cloud Boundaries army wouldn't be able to take care of each other and would definitely start to panic. When that time came, it would be a great opportunity for them. In fact, if they completely fell apart because of this, it would be easier for them to win. However, after thinking about these ingenious methods, Bai Cheng felt a little uncomfortable in his heart. If he was here, he would be able to confirm these things in less than half an hour. However, they had to discuss for half a day before they completely finalized it. When he thought about that young junior, Bai Cheng felt more and more grieved. It wasn't easy for their by bloodline to produce an ambitious little fellow who was proficient in both the pen and the sword. Who would have thought that he would die here in the end? The more Bai Cheng thought about it, the angrier he became. In addition, Bai Xingyun was nowhere to be found. Bai Cheng's heart started to become ruthless. He swore that he would make all living things in the drifting cloud boundary die with Bai Wuxi. Even a blade of grass wouldn't be able to survive. Ancestor, there's no need to worry too much. An old man smiled bitterly. Bai Cheng rolled his eyes at him with a look of disdain. The old man also smiled awkwardly. He naturally understood the meaning behind it. However, he had to accept his fate and accept this helpless reality. He was already on the verge of death. It was normal for the ancestor to ignore him. Originally, he wanted to add some face for his descendants in this battle. Who would have thought that the situation would turn out like this? He felt that it wouldn't be easy for him to return alive. The old man wasn't afraid that he would die on the battlefield. He was afraid that his ancestor would be unhappy and kill him with a slap. Ling Luan, tell me, what are our chances of winning this battle? Bai Cheng asked with a smile. A middle-aged man immediately cupped his hands and said, "In my opinion, our deployment this time is thorough. We will definitely win." This person was called Bai Lingluan. He was also a genius in the past. It was only after Bai Wuxi appeared that his limelight was completely suppressed. It could be said that Bai Lingluan was the one who suggested splitting up the troops this time. Because Bai Lingluan liked to use his brain, he temporarily became a rare talent in Bai Cheng's eyes. As for replacing Bai Wuxi, that was something that would never happen. Since Bai Wuxi was gone, there was no longer anyone who would be in charge of the Bai bloodline in the future. At least Bai Lingluan knew how to use his brain a little. He seemed to be a good choice. With proper training, they might even gain something. After receiving the ancestors' attention again, Bai Lingluan was a little excited. He even felt that the time for him to stand out had arrived. If he could perform well in this battle, he might become a popular person in the tribe. It was even possible that he would reach an unattainable level. Everything would be decided in this battle. Chapter 23:55. On summit Victory Mountain, Muyang and Luo Ji stood at a high point, looking at the smoke and dust billowing in front of them. A large army was approaching. They looked at each other and smiled. This was because when the enemy started moving, Xiaoyang had already explained the situation. In fact, he even explained the situation of the other party clearly and made the best possible response to the situation. Qin Wang and Li Fengmu both left Summit Victory Mountain and led their men to different places to intercept the small teams. Since they had the chance to defeat them one by one, they naturally wouldn't miss such a great opportunity. Mu Yang and Luo Ji were left behind. They had to stay here and hold Summit Victory Mountain for a longer period of time. When they returned after eliminating all the troops, they would start the final battle. Zhao Wang's eyes were like torches as he stared ahead. Now that he was the controller of the Thousand Hearts United Formation, he felt a lot of pressure. The one who replaced him was Ji Fei. The adjustment this time could be said to be perfect. Xiaoyang even directly gave up on the defense at the back and moved everyone to this place. It was all for the sake of wiping out all the warriors from the White Bear tribe in this battle. With such a great opportunity, they naturally had to plan it well. Moreover, they had to show off the might of their Four Realms Alliance in this battle. They had to let everyone know that their Four Realms Alliance wasn't a pushover. Anyone could come and pinch them. Since they came, they would have to pay the price. As for whether they could bear it or not, that would depend on their own thoughts. In order to deal with these vicious people, one had to be even more vicious than them to be able to suppress them. Moreover, in this kind of battle, there was no room for compromise. That old man by Cheng really came. Looks like the pressure on the two of us isn't small. Mu Yang said with a bit of worry. Luo Ji nodded in agreement. Although Princess Mingzhu didn't fall into a disadvantageous position before, in the end, they weren't Princess Mingzhu. There were monsters in every world, but there weren't many of them. Although they were a group of people at the top, they weren't considered heaven-defying. Looking at the enemy's formation, I know they aren't simple. I don't know how long I can last. Zhao Wang said helplessly. Of course, it would be fine if Bai Cheng didn't make a move. They could make up for the difference in strength through some micro-manipulations. However, it would be impossible for them to block the attack of that absolute combat power. However, they were not in a hurry. Their only task now was to stall for time. As long as news of victory came from other places, many things would become much simpler. It could be said that all the top combatants in the Summit Victory Mountain had been completely dispersed to resolve those worries. Once their worries were resolved, they would no longer have to worry about anything. At that time, there would be conditions for a decisive battle. It was just that these were easier said than done. However, it was not that easy to do. Even though Xiaoyang had listed out all sorts of possibilities for them and gave them a solution to deal with it, how could things go according to their ideas and thoughts? Your Highness, why do you need to think so much? The way I see it, the other party is also somewhat fearful and doesn't dare to act rashly. Luo Ji laughed. When Mu Yang heard this, he smiled knowingly. This time, it wasn't as simple as a contest of strength. At the same time, it was a psychological contest. Zhao Wang looked at the majestic army and frowned. He nodded. Since they had a plan, they would execute it themselves. Let's see if that old bastard Bai Cheng has reached the point where his mind is muddled. Ji Fei added. Mu Yang laughed and said, I heard that he's already several tens of thousands of years old. From the last time he retreated, it can be seen that he's already muddled. We just need to scare him a little, and it'll be enough to make him fearful. Hearing these words, the old Prime Minister only smiled and didn't say anything. Now, the old Prime Minister didn't speak much because he had learned many things from this group of rising stars. He was old, and it was easy for him to walk into a dead end when thinking about problems. As such, it wasn't bad to listen more. If he heard a problem, he could just point it out. However, before a decisive battle like this, it wasn't bad to be able to use words to keep everyone in a relaxed state. If everyone was extremely nervous, there might even be trouble because of this. Old dog Bai Cheng, you're finally here. Princess Mingzhu has been waiting for you for a long time. She said that it was a pity that she wasn't able to determine a victor with you last time. This time, we must determine a victor. Luo Ji walked out and said loudly. When these words came out, the confident Bai Cheng's face turned gloomy. At the same time, his eyes began to search quickly. He wanted to find that woman. If she was ambushing somewhere, it would be a terrifying matter. Furthermore, the other party's tight defense made him wonder if they were setting a trap for him. Bai Cheng was very unhappy, but he was afraid of being entangled by that woman. As such, he had no choice but to think of another way. Bai Lingluan, bring some people to scout them out first. There's no need to rush. It won't be too late for us to go all out after the other small groups have started fighting. Since they want to use their main force to tie us down, we'll do the same to them. Bai Cheng's eyes twitched as he said sternly. When he heard these words, Bai Lingluan's heart was filled with excitement. This was because he had already felt that he was being valued very highly. Moreover, this battle might even become a stage for him to perform. Understood, Bai Lingluan said respectfully. After speaking, Bai Lingluan waved his hand, and several experts stepped out one after another, preparing to go with him to scout out the power of the Pine Victory Mountain. Bai Cheng was constantly searching for the woman's whereabouts to ensure his safety. After Xiao Yang eliminated Bai Liwei's team, he quickly headed for the Dark Night Holy Land, because there was also a small group heading there. Originally, Xiao Yang only needed to eliminate one small group, and then leave the rest to others. However, because the Dark Night Holy Land's location was special, it was not easy to dispatch people there. He could only make a trip there himself. As for the Pine Victory Mountain, even if the battle had already started, he could not do anything. All he could do was to end the battle quickly. As long as he could take down the opponent quickly, it would work. In a short while, Xiao Yang caught up with the second small group he had to deal with. Chapter 2356. Bai Li Shang, who was leading the group, suddenly felt a killing intent. He turned around and saw a man in a black robe charging towards him with a sword in his hand. Immediately, his expression changed drastically, and his expression became a lot more solemn because of this. Bai Li Shang recognized this face. It was Xiao Yang. Now, Bai Li Shang couldn't help but be stunned. How could Xiao Yang appear here? For a moment, countless doubts appeared in Bai Li Shang's heart. He couldn't figure out what was going on, but at the same time he felt a sense of danger. For Xiao Yang to suddenly appear here, there must be a reason behind it. Seeing that his whereabouts had been discovered, Xiao Yang did not rush forward. Instead, he slowed down his pace. "Why are you here?" Bai Li Shang asked in disbelief. There were so many unforeseen events and problems that he could not figure out. Logically speaking, things should not have developed like this. In that case, what was the problem in all of this? Xiao Yang smiled calmly and said, "Don't tell me that you still don't know why I am here." When he asked this, the two people beside Bai Li Shang subconsciously took a few steps back, because the meaning of these words could also be pondered. Instantly, Bai Li Shang's face darkened. He scolded, "Don't you dare slander me." "I'm slandering you. What you said is quite interesting," Xiao Yang said as the corners of his mouth curled up. His playful expression was exposed. At this moment, the people who retreated looked at Bai Li Shang with suspicion. It could be said that the dispute between the two factions had never stopped. Sometimes it was possible for a person to be stupid to the extreme. Under the influence of huge benefits, it was not surprising that some people would make such a decision. Seeing Xiao Yang approaching step by step, Bai Li Shang could not control himself and was about to reveal his true form. Facing such an opponent, how could Bai Li Shang be careless? Furthermore, Xiao Yang's appearance at this place was simply too strange. Dao still didn't know what was going on. However, I forgot to tell you that Bai Liwei is already dead. I was the one who killed him." As Xiaoyang spoke, the smile on his face became even wider. Suddenly, Bai Lishang's gaze froze. If Xiaoyang had found Bai Lishang, then it might just be a coincidence. However, was Bai Liwei's death really just a coincidence? Furthermore, Xiaoyang had disappeared at the same time as Bai Xingyun. Therefore, there must be something fishy going on. Could it be that the two of them had secretly reached some kind of agreement? When he thought of this, Bai Lishang's expression couldn't help but tremble, although he also felt that it was somewhat inconceivable. The fact that Xiaoyang could appear in this place unscathed was enough to explain many things. Coupled with Bai Liwei's death, he was able to confirm some of his thoughts. "Haha!" Bai Lishang laughed. However, at the same time he quickly threw out his hands and hit the heads of the two martial emperors with the surname Bai. The two martial emperors had only just become martial emperors and their foundations were not stable yet. Faced with Bai Lishang's sudden attack, how could they block it? Their heads exploded. "I didn't expect that the Bai bastards would collude with you to ostracize us," Bai Lishang scolded. Bai Lishang also didn't expect this to happen. However, when he connected the dots, he was also very frightened. "Why are you so anxious? You are indeed like Bai Wuxi. You are naturally suspicious and afraid that the people around you will harm you. However, if I told you that I didn't collude with them, what would you think? However, I still have to thank you. Killing two martial emperors saved me a lot of effort," Xiaoyang said with a smile. As soon as he said that, the soldiers beside Bai Lishang subconsciously retreated. Their eyes were also filled with fear. The sudden change just now was even more unexpected. Everything had happened so quickly that no one could react in time. What was going on? After hearing these words, Bai Lishang was very annoyed. He knew that he had fallen into Xiaoyang's trap. However, his heart didn't waver. The fact that Xiaoyang was alive and standing here was enough to explain many things. Moreover, how could he know so much information so clearly? There was something fishy going on in all of this. In the next moment, Xiaoyang rushed forward with his sword. Right now, the only person he needed to take care of was Bai Lishang. This made him very confident. He didn't need to worry about others running away, so he could do whatever he wanted. "You want to kill me? Impossible!" Bai Lishang shouted angrily and threw out a punch. Suddenly, lightning flashed and countless thunderbolts swept out like fierce dragons. With a single slash, Xiaoyang slashed the lightning dragon in half. Bai Lishang took advantage of this gap and jumped up. It was obvious that he wanted to escape. In Bai Lishang's opinion, no matter what the situation was, he wouldn't be able to survive after killing two martial emperors from the Bai clan. Therefore, he could only run far away to have a chance of survival. If he forced himself to stay here, he would be killed by Xiaoyang. Since there was a dead end everywhere, he might as well try a new path. Maybe he could survive. However, when Bai Lishang rushed into the air, he saw a huge ball of fire coming down on him. In the blink of an eye, Bai Lishang's body was ignited. The fire burned even more fiercely. It could be said that every step was within Xiaoyang's calculations. Everything was going perfectly. Bai Lishang's suspicious personality could be used to save a lot of trouble. The few remaining polar bear warriors who were still alive were trembling with fear and trepidation. Although they had yet to fully recover from the shock and figure out what was going on, the pressure they felt made them extremely afraid. Would Xiaoyang let them go? Of course, that was impossible. Since they chose to invade the drifting cloud realm, they were already sentenced to death the moment they set foot here. After Xiaoyang sliced off Bai Lishang's head, he turned around and charged towards the few white bears that were still alive. When cutting grass, he naturally had to remove the roots. Moreover, under such circumstances, he couldn't let any information leak out. Chapter 2357. Xiaoyang heaved a long sigh of relief after dealing with this pair of people. The troubles that he had anticipated to be dealt with had all been dealt with. As for the other teams, it would depend on whether the Qin Emperor and Li Fengmu's methods were fierce enough. Soon after, Xiaoyang began to observe how the other teams were doing, while he headed towards Mount Pin victory. At this moment, Li Fengmu had already intercepted his opponent and unsheathed his heavenly sword. The murderous intent was unparalleled. Countless strands of sword qi were restless, as if they would slice all his opponents into pieces in the blink of an eye. Li Fengmu stood there proudly, his eyes filled with excitement. Behind him were the bald man and Qin Mingho. "If you two want to practice, hurry up." "I'm in a hurry," Li Fengmu said in a low voice. The bald man and Chen Mingho felt somewhat helpless in the face of this impatient sword cultivator. They could only suppress some of their thoughts for now. They had even said that they could find an opponent of similar strength to spar, but it seemed that was still not possible. "The big picture is more important," Chen Mingho said coldly. Moreover, this was only the appetizer. The final battle was still to come. No matter how one looked at it, wasting too much time here was indeed an extremely unwise thing to do. Thus, they were all well aware of what to do. The warriors of the White Bear tribe were completely ignored, and they couldn't help but feel furious. If it was that girl, then so be it. But what right did you rotten fish and shrimps have to ignore them? Moreover, if they really fought, it was still unknown who would emerge victorious. Arrogant. The leader, Bai Fong, rebuked angrily. To be able to cultivate to this level, who among them wasn't a person with outstanding talent. Moreover, it was still unknown who would emerge victorious in today's battle. "Looks like you guys are still unconvinced," Li Fengmu said with a contemptuous smile. As he spoke, the heavenly sword in Li Fengmu's hand trembled. Immediately, countless strands of sword qi surged out, crisscrossing around him. The bald man and Qin Mingho, who were closer, also felt a sharp aura. At the same time, they felt a stabbing pain. This was Li Fengmu's aura. After a long period of comprehension, his sword Dao had also reached a higher level. Especially after witnessing Bai Jian's mental journey, his improvement in the way of the sword increased even more. Wherever the sword qi passed, some of the flowers and grass were cut into pieces. After feeling the sword qi, the White Bear warrior subconsciously took a few steps back, because they were afraid that the sword intent would land on their bodies. Slash! Li Fengmu roared and slashed out with his sword. Suddenly, a huge sword aura came down from the sky, aiming directly for Bai Fong's head. It was very powerful. Bai Fong roared furiously and revealed his true form in an instant. Looking at the monstrous sword essence that was descending, he raised his hands and countless thunderbolts surged out like shackles. It was as if he wanted to break the sword essence. The situation of the battle could be said to have changed in an instant. The monstrous sword intent suddenly shattered like snowflakes falling down, and it was extremely beautiful. However, every single snowflake also contained an endless amount of sword intent and killing intent. "Be careful!" Bai Fong immediately shouted. In the face of such superb swordsmanship, he was a little panicked. This warning only made the two martial royal realm experts a little more vigilant, but it was still a little too late. In a moment, their bodies were already full of sword marks. As for the rest of the warriors who had not stepped into the martial royal realm, they were directly cut into pieces and died suddenly. Chen Mingho and the bald man looked at the scene in front of them and could not help but swallow a mouthful of saliva. This old ancestor of the sword heart world truly had some skills. This move was even more powerful. Under the circumstances where the patriarch's intentions were not in the wine, he had taken care of these small fries. Bai Fong looked at the brothers who had died beside him and was unable to restrain his anger. He was very cautious, but he did not expect to fall into his opponent's trap. Only now did he understand that the target of the sword had never been him. Whether you can kill him or not depends on your own abilities. After I kill Bai Fong, I will take care of the battlefield. After Li Fengmu finished speaking, he took the heavenly sword killer and left. Now, Li Fengmu's mind was completely focused on the final battle. He wanted to finish the appetizers here as soon as possible. Chun Mingho and the bald man looked at each other. Then each performed their own techniques and charged forward. The two martial royal realm opponents were already severely injured, so the strength they could display was limited. Therefore, this was also a great opportunity to kill them. If they were unable to take him down under such circumstances, then their strength was truly questionable. On the other side, Emperor Qin sat on a high slope with Shen Wushuang and Shen Luo. Their golden helmets and armor shone brightly under the sunlight. The cold gleam on the tip of their spears was even more intimidating. Shen Wushuang and Shen Luo sat there, looking as if they were ready to watch a good show. It was as if the two of them were completely uninvolved. Can the two of you be a little more serious? It's not easy for you to get the chance to watch fourth uncle fight. You have to learn my heroic moves well, Emperor Qin teased. Shen Wushuang nodded solemnly and said, all right. I won't even blink. Even if you're killed, I'll watch with my eyes wide open. As soon as he said that, Emperor Qin was fuming with rage. He wanted nothing more than to hang Shen Wushuang up and give him a good beating. However, he could only put that thought aside for the time being when he thought about the impending battle. You brat, you're always so sloppy. What? Do you think you can challenge me just because you've made some achievements in your cultivation level? Emperor Qin said and rolled up his sleeves, looking like he was ready to fight. There was nothing Shen Luo could do about it. These two were just like that. Bring it on. Let's see who's more powerful then, Shen Wushuang said and stood up immediately. The flames of war between the two seemed to have been ignited. It was as if neither of them wanted to take a step back, so they began to compete. Ha, you brat. You're really a troublemaker, Emperor Qin said angrily. Shen Wushuang pulled out a long spear right away and said, bring it on. Meanwhile, Shen Luo sat on the side. He wanted nothing more than to cover his ears. These two fellows were really too much. However, in the next moment, Shen Luo suddenly stood up because he saw that the target had arrived. They're here, Shen Luo yelled. In front of them, a group of people was rushing over. When the group of people saw the three martial emperors in golden helmets and armor, they could not help trying to figure out what was going on. The three of them seemed to be waiting for them. Chapter 2358. Pine Victory Mountain. Bai Cheng had been searching for the whereabouts of the woman in white, but no matter how hard he tried, he could not sense her aura. This made Bai Cheng very uncomfortable. He could conclude that the woman must be hiding somewhere and was ready to give him a fatal blow at any time. Otherwise, she would not be so calm. At the same time, Bai Cheng also noticed something different. This time, there were two people missing from their lineup. He still had no idea what those two people were doing. How could anyone not be suspicious about this? Therefore, Bai Cheng didn't know where the problem lay. You two go check the surroundings and see what's going on, Bai Cheng ordered in a low voice. After receiving the order, the two people did not dare to be careless and immediately went to check the surroundings. This was because they felt that something was very wrong with the invasion today. It was as if there was a conspiracy waiting for them. At the very least, compared to the previous time, the response today was too different. Moreover, the opponent's goal seemed to be very simple, which was to guard Pine Victory Mountain. If they could not come out to fight, they would not move at all. Bai Cheng was also thinking about this problem. He felt that the current atmosphere had become a little strange. But what exactly was wrong, he couldn't put his finger on it. Moreover, the opponent's response seemed to be well behaved, but many key people were replaced. Bai Lingluan did not notice this because he was completely focused on how to break through the line of defense. This was because he felt that success was already close at hand. Although it seemed that there was no progress now, he already had some plans in his heart. At the same time, he began to deduce in his heart how he could best break through this array formation. Once he succeeded, Bai Lingluan's status in the clan would naturally rise. It was also because of the temptation of such huge benefits that Bai Lingluan worked extra hard. This also caused him to have almost no observation on some details. All he saw was a bright future and the glory and wealth in the future. This feeling made him feel very wonderful. It was as if everything was close at hand and within reach. However, many things seemed incomparably beautiful, but if one wanted to obtain them, it was not an easy thing to do. King Zhao's response was very appropriate, but he was still a little shaky. If it wasn't for Ji Fei cleaning up the mess at the side, perhaps some place would have been broken through. It wasn't that King Zhao wasn't capable enough, but that his control over the array formation was still lacking. Previously, it was only because old Cheng had told him a little about it that he had some understanding of it. However, it was still somewhat difficult to use it freely. Luo Ji and Mu Yang stood at the front. They weren't in a hurry to attack. Instead, they stood there and chatted. As they spoke, their gazes never left the main battlefield. If an expert from the other side made a move, then the two of them would immediately come out to lure the enemy. Who would have thought that the White Bear tribe would send out such an idiot as the main attacker? Luo Ji said with disdain after watching for a long time. Mu Yang nodded in agreement, agreeing with this point of view. Not to mention the fact that their attacks were completely disorganized and there was no way for them to win. Even if they used brute force, they wouldn't be able to force them to switch to someone else to control the formation. From this, it could be seen how clumsy their methods were. That's a good thing. Mu Yang said with a smile. Luo Ji didn't refute. That was indeed the case. After all they needed to do now was to stall for time at the front. The longer they could stall for time, the better. When Xiaoyang and the others returned, they would be able to take the initiative to attack. The opponent still doesn't understand us. They actually split up, as if they're afraid that we won't be able to take them down one by one. Luo Ji said with a bitter smile. On this point, Mu Yang didn't agree. After all, it wasn't easy to determine the pros and cons of this matter. If the flowing cloud realm didn't have Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu, then once the opponent split up, it would be difficult for them to deal with them. It could only be said that the White Bear tribe strategy didn't have any problems. They were just unlucky. If it wasn't for the existence of these two monsters, they might really be able to make their plans work. But Bai Cheng, that old bastard, is really cautious. The circle of martial emperors around him already makes people feel inferior. Mu Yang said helplessly. Luo Ji also smiled bitterly. Who would have thought of such an arrangement? It had to be said that Bai Cheng was still very afraid of death, especially after the battle with Princess Mingzhu. All of his arrogance and sharpness had been restrained. Bai Cheng also knew that this was the world of the younger generation. He couldn't help but admit that he was old. At the same time, Bai Cheng began to calculate in his mind. According to the time, the other small teams had already arrived and started to attack. If they started, then he could also start to attack. At that time, he would be able to take down the flowing cloud realm from both sides. Bai Cheng looked at the offensive in front of him and felt a headache. When this guy came up with a strategy, his brain was still clear. He did a good job. But who would have thought that when it came to commanding, he was a complete mess? It was like a joke. Some of the opinions he had before were now destroyed. Now, Bai Cheng also felt helpless. It seemed that the Bai family wouldn't be able to produce someone who could shoulder the burden. Second brother, let's prepare for the offensive. Bai Cheng suddenly sat up from his chair and sighed. Now, Bai Cheng was very disappointed. He even felt that he shouldn't have had any hope. If an idiot couldn't show off in thousands of years, then he was an idiot. So, from the beginning, he shouldn't have had any hope. On Taste Victory Mountain, a black-robed young man silently appeared. When the young man appeared, everyone present was shocked. They didn't even notice that the young man had appeared here without anyone noticing. Can you not suddenly appear in the future? That's too scary. Mu Yang's mouth twitched as he complained. Xiaoyang nodded and said, next time. Looking at the battle in front of him, Xiaoyang was also helpless. He had originally planned to assassinate them, but the opponents were too vigilant and he couldn't do it. So, he could only return to Taste Victory Mountain, and Wait. Chapter 2359. Why had Bai Cheng become so vigilant all of a sudden? This was something that no one could figure out. However, according to the information in Bai Wuxi's consciousness, Xiaoyang was able to understand this person. This old guy had lived for tens of thousands of years and had experienced many battles of life and death. However, the more a person experienced, the more complicated their state of mind would become. Bai Cheng was an obvious example. He also wanted to preserve his life because he had lived for too long. Therefore, in the last battle, because he saw Princess Mingju's power and methods, he became somewhat timid. Because he did not have full confidence, he did not want to make a move. He would even deliberately pay attention to his own safety. This was also why Bai Cheng had been holed up in West Wind City for the past 10 days and did not dare to take the initiative to attack. If it was not for the situation, Bai Cheng would have continued to wait for Bai Xingyun's return. It could be said that Bai Cheng's attack this time was because he had no other choice. If it was not for the pressure from both sides being too great, he would have chosen to not make a move and wait for the situation to become clearer before making a move. However, the arrow was already nocked and had to be released. Bai Cheng had no choice but to make a move. However, in this situation, he had to plan everything clearly before making a move. Moreover, he felt that this plan was not bad. When the time came, once the flowing cloud world fell into a situation of internal and external troubles, it would be difficult to deal with the situation. In the end, it could only be destroyed. Thinking of this move, Bai Cheng felt a little smug. This was quite a clever move. Looks like that old turtle is prepared to use this method to exhaust us to death. Xiaoyang said with a bitter smile. As long as the other party did not make a move easily, there would not be any flaws. This way, it would be difficult to defeat him. Regarding this, Xiaoyang felt a little helpless. These old foxes had a lot of things planned in their hearts. However, it was not that there was no way to deal with this kind of person. However, it was still difficult to execute. Moreover, there was no space. With you here, do we still need to worry about this problem? Mu Yang said with a smile. Since Xiaoyang was now calm and composed, everything must be within his expectations. Therefore, this young man must have calculated everything, which was why he was so confident. If they didn't have a way to deal with it, they would have been like ants on a hot pan long ago. How could they still stand here and talk so calmly? Luo Ji, on the other hand, had a faint smile on his face. He also felt that this was indeed the case. Previously, when Luo Ji heard many rumors, she felt that they were exaggerated. But today, when he fought side by side with Xiaoyang, he finally understood that those rumors were unreliable. As for Xiaoyang himself, he was like a stabilizing needle in the sea. With him standing here, this place was as solid as an iron bucket, difficult to break through. Furthermore, his ability was also extremely outstanding. Leader Xiao really destroyed 2 small teams so quickly. Luo Ji suddenly thought of something and said in disbelief. Xiaoyang smiled and nodded, saying that's right. Hearing this, Luo Ji's expression couldn't help but change. He felt that this was a little too unbelievable. How long had it been? And Xiaoyang had already killed 2 third-level martial emperors. How did he do it? Could it be that he was really a monster? Thinking of this, the shock in Luo Ji's heart grew more and more. This was a little hard to accept. How terrifying was this guy's strength? Suddenly, Luo Ji seemed to be able to believe that Bai Xingyun was really dead and had fallen in the hands of this young man. Luo Ji carefully sized up this young man, but because of the black robe, he couldn't clearly sense his aura and couldn't determine his cultivation level. I am now a 3rd-level martial emperor. Seeing this, Xiaoyang added, it would have been better if he didn't say this. Once he said it, Luo Ji couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. This was a little too perverse, wasn't it? This person was truly somewhat invincible among those of the same level. As such, Luo Ji could only bitterly smile and shake his head. In Luo Ji's opinion, If Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu were to fight, it would be hard to say who would win in the end. It could be said that since the start of the war with the White Bear tribe, Xiaoyang and Princess Mingzhu were the two almighty people standing at the top. It was also because of their existence that they were able to hold on and not be defeated too badly. In fact, the few victories they had obtained proved many questions and conjectures. Thinking of these questions, Luo Ji revealed a trace of a smile. Since there was a strong person holding the fort, they didn't have to worry about facing a disaster at all. Therefore, in the following days, they only had to work hard and fight. Once their overall strength increased, they wouldn't have to worry about these things anymore. Mu Yang bitterly smiled and shook his head. He also couldn't understand this young man. Sometimes his breakthroughs in cultivation level were just that strange. Moreover, Xiaoyang was a third-level martial emperor. That was no ordinary third-level martial emperor. Looks like Bai Cheng will also die here today. Mu Yang smiled. Although Bai Cheng was a fourth-level martial emperor, his strength could be said to be strong. However, meeting Xiaoyang was his misfortune. No matter how cunning Bai Cheng was, when Princess Mingzhu arrived and the two monsters of the Four-Realm Alliance attacked together, what reason would they have to leave alive? However, they weren't in a hurry now. They had to wait for the other battles to decide the outcome. Although Xiaoyang was here, it was still difficult for them to take the initiative to attack with the strength they had left behind in the Taste Victory Mountain. It could even be said that the strength they had was only enough for defense. If they killed their way out, they would only be looking for trouble. It's best if we can annihilate them all here. Xiaoyang sneered. Since the White Bear tribe wanted to fight to the death with them, they would have to pay the price. Otherwise, the other tribes in the Wanshou realm would think that they were easy to bully. Mu Yang and Luo Ji nodded in agreement, now that they had yet to gain a firm foothold. If they didn't act ruthlessly, how could they intimidate the others? Moreover, the more desperate the situation was, the more they had to show their temperament. So what if you're a fierce tiger? Even if I lose my life, I'll pull out a few of your teeth. At the foot of the Taste Victory Mountain, there was another change. The attacks were stronger than before. Chapter 2360. At this point, Bai Cheng finally could not hold it in anymore. He felt that, according to common sense, the other small teams had already started fighting and had invaded the more important cities. Once they took down all of them, Summit Victory Mountain would be isolated and without help. What he needed to do now was to make the cultivators in Summit Victory Mountain unable to take half a step out and restrain them there. That was the only way everything could proceed smoothly. By then, so what if they managed to defend Summit Victory Mountain? Once the rear was cut off and the mountain became an isolated island, the people's hearts would definitely scatter. By then, they would have lost their will to fight. Would it not be easy to take down the mountain? Sometimes it was also a brilliant tactic to wear down the enemy's will. As long as it could be done, it might have a miraculous effect. When he thought of this, the anger in Bai Cheng's heart subsided a little. Otherwise, if this stalemate continued, he would really go crazy. He had gone all out to invade, but only gained the cities that the other party had abandoned. In the end, he had suffered heavy losses. If news of this spread, it would be extremely disgraceful. Therefore, if he wanted to erase all of the details, there was only one choice, which was to completely take down the Drift Cloud realm. The winner took it all, and that had always been the case. Bai Lingluan had retreated, but he looked dejected at the moment. Bai Lingluan knew very well that he had missed a great opportunity. He initially thought that as long as he could take down Summit Victory Mountain, he would surely receive great credit. However, the final outcome made him feel helpless. If he had been a little smarter and made some progress, things would not have ended up like this. However, there was no point in regretting it now, because the opportunity had been missed. Bai Lingluan glanced at the patriarch beside him. Seeing that the patriarch didn't even bother to look at him, the up-and-coming patriarch felt even more uncomfortable. Such a good opportunity had been missed, just like that. Who could possibly feel good in their heart? But sometimes the world was just so wonderful. In this short period of time, they had experienced too many ups and downs. It was as if it was destined by fate and nobody could change it. Nonetheless, the disappointment was only temporary because Bai Ling Luin felt that he still had a chance. Whether or not he would be able to hold it in his hands in the future would depend on his luck. After all, he was still alive. As long as he was alive, he would have the opportunity to shine and show others his brilliance. Bai Cheng stared at Taste Victory Mountain. At the same time, the fierceness in his eyes grew. However, the people he sent out all returned one after another and reported clearly that there was no trace of that woman in the surroundings. Furthermore, they didn't even see any ambushers or sentries. Bai Cheng couldn't help but frown even more when he heard the news. If that was the case, then what exactly was the Flowing Cloud realm planning? Regarding this, Bai Cheng had too many doubts in his heart. Moreover, he could not obtain an answer. Questions came one after another, and Bai Cheng felt a headache coming on. These messy matters were really annoying. However, as the commander-in-chief of an army, he had no choice but to think carefully. Furthermore, he would not allow any mistakes to happen. Sometimes, things just made people feel so helpless. No matter how you schemed in the end, it was inevitable that some mistakes would occur. Moreover, these mistakes might cause you to suffer a great loss. However, after careful consideration, Bai Cheng was indeed unable to figure out how his opponent could make a comeback. All of this seemed to have been set in stone long ago. The battle in front of Taste Victory Mountain was still very anxious. Even with the addition of 2/3 level martial emperors this time, it was difficult to break the current deadlock. The 10,000 Hearts joint effort formation was an existence that would become stronger when faced with a strong opponent. In addition, because they were resisting the enemy together, many cultivators had the same thoughts. In addition to the cooperation from the previous few times, they had practiced it to a level where they could do it with ease. It was as if everything was at their fingertips and did not need to spend too much effort at all. At this time, Ji Fei also stood out and immediately took over Zhao Wang's place. If King Zhao was still standing here, then his carelessness would have resulted in him being torn apart by the other party. In fact, it was even possible that this opening could lead to a rout. However, it would be different if Ji Fei was in control. He was even a person who participated in the construction of this formation, so he knew every detail very well. After Ji Fei took over the formation, it immediately underwent a great change. When the two leaders sensed the sudden increase in the power of the formation, they looked at each other. Their eyes were filled with confusion. This sudden change made them realize that Taste Victory Mountain was still the same Taste Victory Mountain. It was the most difficult place for them to take down. Moreover, their opponents' preparations were very ample. Moreover, they had used a defensive strategy from the very beginning, followed by a pattern of them becoming stronger as well. This made them realize that this matter was not simple. Just what kind of secret was hidden in this tiny drifting cloud world that could actually make them make so many changes? Isn't it time for us to make a move now? Mu Yang said with a smile. Since their opponent had already begun to use their peak strength, if they did not make a move, who knew how many cultivators would not be able to withstand the pressure of the 10,000 Hearts joint effort formation and would end up dying. Moreover, there was not much they needed to do. They only needed to slightly obstruct them. As long as they could not attack the formation with all their strength, their goal would be achieved. Luo Ji, who was standing to the side, was already eager to make a move. There were even traces of coldness seeping out from his body. Although their battle intent had risen to the peak, they did not act blindly without thinking. That was because Xiaoyang had not given the order, so they naturally did not dare to make a move. In this decisive battle with the White Bear tribe, they had made many plans. Most of them were Xiaoyang's painstaking efforts. Even some details had been polished to the point of perfection by him. Sometimes it might not seem like a big deal to make a move early, but it could cause a chain reaction or even completely change the situation. That was possible. I think their battle is almost done. Let me declare war. Xiaoyang said as he unsheathed his divine sword. Chapter 2361. After unsheathing the divine sword, Xiaoyang leaped down from Pine Victory Mountain. This guy is really too much. He didn't even leave us a single bone to eat. Luo Ji joked. Mu Yang nodded in agreement and said, he really likes to be in the limelight. He even said that the two of us would be able to achieve some dazzling battle results. In the end, this guy wants to eat all of it. Although the two of them looked helpless and bitter, they were overjoyed in their hearts, because from their point of view, with Xiaoyang's help, everything would be in order. There were many things that they did not have to worry about. Moreover, with Xiaoyang's previous battle results, if he took action, the battle could be settled in a short time. He could even catch the opponent off guard. Furthermore, if Xiaoyang were to show himself now, some of the problems would become much simpler. At least, it would be a great blow to the enemy's morale. Whether or not they could withstand such pressure would become an unknown. At least, they enjoyed the process very much. Since they were able to exterminate the other party, that was naturally the best outcome. There was no need to worry about other things. The two third-level martial emperors looked at the black figure rushing towards them and laughed disdainfully. They did not expect that there would still be someone who dared to rush out at this time. If they were not prepared before, they would not be able to stop him. But now, if they rushed out, they would be courting their own deaths. The two of them did not dare to be careless. They had already fought with the Almighty of the Four-Realm Alliance before, so they knew some of the opponent's background. If he didn't pay attention, he would lose his life. Of course, as long as it was not the woman who could fight head-on with the ancestor, they did not think it would be a problem and could take her down. Everyone's thoughts could be said to be very pure, and they could see through it. Formation! One of them shouted angrily. Immediately, the white bear warriors who had not moved before started running again. In the next moment, bolts of lightning shot up into the sky. As they weaved together, they formed a majestic scene that shocked everyone. When Xiaoyang saw this, he only frowned slightly, because as far as he was concerned, it was nothing more than that, so why worry so much? Moreover, he had absolute strength. As long as Bai Cheng did not make a move, he could guarantee his own safety. Knowing that it was a trap, Xiaoyang did not hesitate and allowed himself to fall. It seems like he's here to test the strength of the formation you've set up this time, to see if it's capable of trapping him. He's in the limelight now. Mu Yang's mouth twitched when he saw this, because they hadn't expected such a situation. Xiaoyang's actions were indeed a little careless. Such behavior was even more excessive. It could be said that this action of his showed that he didn't put his opponent in his eyes at all, and was extremely arrogant. This is Xiaoyang. He wants to make his opponents despair and lose all their morale. Luo Ji said excitedly. It could be said that Xiaoyang's approach was completely looking down on his opponent. Moreover, as soon as he gained a small advantage, it would be a fatal blow to the enemy. However, Luo Ji still could not understand because Xiaoyang had the chance to heavily injure one of them. Why did he give up on such an opportunity? By now, Luo Ji could not see through this young man at all. However, this made sense. He did not act according to plan, but when he worked together, he formed a miraculous hand. That was why he was so terrifying. Sometimes it didn't seem logical, but after connecting all the dots, one could see how powerful he was. But doing this is too risky. If something happens to him, how are we going to counterattack? Mu Yang said unhappily. Young and hot-blooded. This was most likely the case for Xiaoyang. It was as if he had never considered how things would develop, and had always acted willfully. His actions were also very willful. If there was even the slightest mistake, he would be doomed eternally. Luo Ji watched on with interest. Since she had the chance to see what sect leader Xiao was capable of, she was more than happy to do so. Moreover, they did not have the right to restrict him, so they might as well watch a good show. Ji Fei only glanced at them, then focused all his attention on the warriors attacking the array. At the same time, he activated the array's power and began to kill the warriors who wanted to charge over. It could be said that with their reckless looks, they would only be sending themselves to their deaths if they charged over. Of course, a martial royal realm expert with a higher cultivation could only force him to retreat. If their cultivations were higher, it would be a headache to deal with. When the people of the White Bear tribe saw the black-robed youth suddenly charge out, their expressions became extremely interesting. At the same time, everyone began to guess in their hearts, what kind of god was this? Or was it that the flowing cloud realm had been hiding its strength all this time? Or was it that there was an unknown rising star who had come out of seclusion today? Questions and doubts appeared in everyone's minds one after another, but they couldn't find an answer that satisfied them for a while. Moreover, this sudden change happened too quickly. The moment the black-robed youth landed, the divine sword in his hand immediately blossomed with two completely different rays of light. Those rays of light were dazzling and piercing. The powerful pressure made the warriors in the array feel breathless, as if they were about to suffocate. In the face of such a powerful aura, the two martial emperors felt a chill in their hearts. They felt that the murderous intent was very strong, and it was as if they could not escape. When the youth landed in the array, he quickly waved the divine sword in his hand. Instantly, one ray of sword chi after another was released, as if it was unparalleled. Looking at the rays of sword chi, Bai Cheng could not help but open his eyes wide. This figure seemed familiar, but he could not put his finger on it. But soon, Bai Cheng recognized the black robe. It was the black robe which he was most satisfied with. It was Bai Wuxi's robe. As the sword chi flowed, the warriors, standing in the array, fell one after another. As for the array, because it lacked a foothold, it directly collapsed. The array had just been set up, but it was broken by a sword. Chapter 2362. The might of a single sword was enough to completely destroy the formation. The crowd were all dumbstruck and unable to accept what they were seeing. This kind of extravagance could be said to be incomparably spectacular, causing one's mind to feel incomparably shocked. Especially the 2/3 level martial emperors who were in charge of the array, they were even more stunned. This was just the beginning, and it was already over. What was going on? Wasn't this method a little too fierce? They still found it hard to come back to their senses, and felt that this matter was too ridiculous. Just how terrifying was that black-robed man's strength to be able to unleash such power with one sword? The more they thought about it, the more questions they had in their hearts. They couldn't even find an answer. The corner of Mu Yang's mouth twitched uncontrollably. He felt that Xiaoyang was a little too arrogant and that it was unwise to put himself in danger. Yet, with just a single sword strike, he managed to break through the formation? This was like a dream. It was hard to accept. Even Luo Ji couldn't help but suck in a breath of cold air. He was also in disbelief. He didn't think that Xiaoyang's heaven-defying level had reached such a terrifying stage. If he really made an enemy of such a person, how terrifying would it be? Just thinking about it made Luo Ji shiver. Although they were cultivators of the same level, if they really fought, Luo Ji couldn't think of a way to win no matter how hard he racked his brains. Bai Cheng abruptly stood up, his eyes almost popping out of their sockets from staring so hard. Now, even his eyes were bloodshot. It was Bai Wu Shi's black robe. Bai Wu Shi had died at the hands of Xiaoyang. The identity of the black-robed young man in front of him was naturally obvious. Bai Lingluan, who was standing at the side, couldn't help but hold his breath. He was also shocked. He felt that this matter was like a dream. It was extremely unreal. Those who were slightly more knowledgeable were filled with doubts because they really couldn't understand what was going on. Many of the White Bear warriors were even more terrified. What they had set up earlier was an exquisite array formation of their race. Even if the formation of the myriad beast realm was very clumsy and could not compare to the ingenuity of the human cultivators, it should not have been broken by a single sword strike. Furthermore, there was nothing exquisite about that sword strike. It was as if it had been forcefully broken apart by the most overbearing power. Just by standing there, he was like a god of war. Just a glance was enough to instill fear in the hearts of those who dared to continue fighting. After Xiao Yang landed on the ground, he casually took off the black robe. Since he had already made his move, even if he continued to wear this robe, it wouldn't be able to conceal much of his aura. Therefore, he might as well be a little more carefree and reveal his full strength so that they would feel fear. When everyone saw the true face of the black-robed youth, they were even more shocked. Xiao Yang stood with his sword in hand. It was as if as long as he stood there, no one would be able to break through the encirclement. Many people subconsciously swallowed a mouthful of saliva. Doubt and fear rapidly rose in their minds. Even the battle intent in the hearts of some of the white bear warriors disappeared without a trace. This was because they felt that under such circumstances, even if they continued to fight, they would only end up dead. Bai Cheng could not believe it. He staggered a few steps back. Looking at the young man, his eyes were almost turning black. In the previous battle, they clearly saw Xiaoyang and Bai Xingyun enter that strange space together. However, now that Xiaoyang had appeared, there was still no trace of Bai Xingyun. Bai Qing already had a rough idea of what was going on. There was only one possibility, and that was that Bai Xingyun was dead. That was why Xiaoyang had returned. However, Bai Xingyun was a half-step fifth-stage existence. At that time, Xiaoyang was only a second-stage martial emperor. How big was the gap in strength between them? How could Bai Xingyun have lost? That was the crux of the matter. Everyone found it hard to believe. All of this didn't make sense at all. Therefore, how to think of this matter became an unsolved mystery in everyone's hearts. There were even some people who felt that what they were seeing was not real. Some were just illusions. This was not real. Xiaoyang! Bai Cheng gritted his teeth and shouted sternly. Xiaoyang smiled, but his smile made countless people tremble with fear. Where's Bai Xingyun? Bai Cheng asked angrily. Xiaoyang shrugged helplessly and said, I killed him, of course. When these words came out, everyone was shocked beyond words. In another battlefield, Li Fengmu sat on a mountain. He took out a rag and gently wiped the blood on the sky sword. As for the Baldi and Chen Mingho, they were cleaning up the battlefield. Their faces were filled with displeasure. Their displeasure was mostly due to the fact that they were not strong enough. When two of their opponents were injured, they could not quickly end the battle. In the end, Li Fengmu had to make a move to kill the two martial emperors. They had experienced many hardships in the outside world and believed that they still had some strength. However, in this battle they had truly witnessed the power of the Sword Heart Realm cultivators. Li Fengmu's sword was indeed incomparably sharp. Moreover, it was also incomparably ruthless. Every move he made was an existence that took one's life. It was also because of this that they were able to end the battle in the shortest time possible. In a battle of the same level, Li Fengmu could not be unscathed, but in the end he still took a few punches. It was also because these punches had injured his internal organs. He had to take advantage of this time to recuperate and stabilize his injuries. After all, this was just an appetizer. The main battlefield was still Victory Mountain. Even if he rushed over now, he would probably not be able to do much because of his poor condition. Therefore, during this period of time, he had to speed up the recovery of his injuries. As for some of the treasured pills, he ate them crazily as if they were free. Li Fengmu stared ahead, and the smile on his face suddenly became much wider. He firmly believed that they would still be able to win in this final battle. On the other side, in front of the Sun Moon sect, a woman in white with a veil on her face floated down. Countless golden swords rained down along with her. This rain of swords looked beautiful and magnificent, but some people below were wailing endlessly. Chapter 2363. Countless golden swords rained down, and countless cries of agony came from a small group of over 10 people below. With just one move, All the cultivators below the martial emperor realm were killed. Some of the people who had just become martial emperors were severely injured, and some of them even lost their ability to fight. The leader raised his head to look at the woman in white, and he could not help but frown. Shouldn't she be at Summit Victory Mountain? Why is she here? The leader gritted his teeth and muttered. Moreover, he also sensed that the woman's swordsmanship had improved a lot compared to the last time they met. He could not help but be afraid of her strength. One must know that the woman was so valiant that she could fight with the great ancestor of the Bai branch for hundreds of rounds. How powerful was her strength! He even heard the great ancestor praising her later on. The great ancestor clearly said that he might not be able to keep his life if they fought for a while longer. The leader immediately felt the pressure in his heart increase tremendously. Facing such a person, even if they were of the same level, he felt helpless. It was to the extent that wanting to compete with him was like a fool's dream. It was simply impossible to achieve. Aren't you afraid that Summit Victory Mountain will be breached by being here? The man shouted angrily. However, what responded to him was sword chi that blotted out the sky and covered the earth. Princess Mingzhu did not think too much about it. She was clear about her mission. She had to wipe out all the small groups that had infiltrated the rear, and she had to rush to the main battlefield. Therefore, she could not waste too much time here. Moreover, it would be the best outcome if she could end the battle quickly. Therefore, why should she think about other things? As long as she settled the matter in front of her, many threads would naturally be solved. Moreover, by then, she would be able to do more things. When the leader saw the sword chi that blotted out the sky and covered the earth, he could not help but feel despair. Facing such a powerhouse, he was even more helpless. It seemed like he could only stretch his neck and let her cut him. However, how could he be willing to die so sullenly? Therefore, the first thing he did was to reveal his original appearance and prepare to fight against him. No matter what, he had to fight his way out. Otherwise, he would really die here. No one wanted to die. They wanted to live. However, that person's resistance was futile. After a few exchanges, his head was chopped off by the sword that was emitting golden light. Princess Mingzhu pulled out the sword expressionlessly. She did not even bother to clean up the spoils of war. Instead, she turned around and left. It could be said that in this cleaning job, because she was the furthest away and the easiest to pull in the net, she took on the most responsibility. However, due to the principle of speed, he only needed to get rid of the last group of people he expected and then rush to the main battlefield. Last time, Bai Cheng and Princess Mingzhu were not able to determine life and death. This made Princess Mingzhu somewhat unhappy. Therefore, this time, her swordsmanship had improved once again. She was even more determined to kill Bai Cheng here. According to the information they had, once Bai Cheng was gone, the White Bear tribe would no longer be a threat to them. As for the retaliation from the Wanshou realm, that was a matter for the future. After all, these threats had to be removed one by one. Moreover, they could not hesitate or be soft-hearted. A white streak of light flashed past, attracting the attention of countless Sun Yin's sect disciples. Bai Cheng stood on the spot. His entire body was trembling, and the veins on his forehead were completely exposed. Bai Cheng was currently in a state of uncontrollable rage. Bai Wuxi's death had already made him feel like dead ashes. Now, Bai Xingyun, who had the highest cultivation level in the Bai tribe, had actually died in the hands of Xiaoyang. How could he accept this? It could be said that the loss of these two key figures had caused the Bai tribe to completely lose the confidence to compete with the Bailey tribe. It was very likely that they would not be able to recover from this setback. Impossible. How could he have been defeated by you? Bai Cheng roared angrily. No matter how he thought about it, Bai Cheng could not accept this reality. He even felt that with Xiaoyang's ability, how could he have possibly killed Bai Xingyun? It could be said that no one was willing to accept this reality. This was because it was simply too ridiculous. It could even be said that it was almost impossible. How could he have been killed with a difference of 2 cultivation levels? Unless Bai Xingyun was a complete idiot. However, how could Bai Xingyun, who had cultivated to half a step to rank 5, be an idiot? If Bai Xingyun was considered an idiot, then there was probably no one in the Bai tribe who was smart. Looking at everyone's shocked expression, the corners of Xiao Yang's mouth curled up slightly. Sure enough, after this news spread, the morale of the other party's army was greatly impacted. Even their morale had fallen to the bottom. Therefore, under such a premise, the other party's unity and combat power would definitely be greatly reduced. In this way, he had achieved his goal. Next, as long as he could kill Bai Cheng, the White Bear tribe would be completely routed and defeated. At this moment, the people of the White Bear tribe tacitly stopped. Everyone's gaze fell on the young man. It could be said that everything started because of him. It was as if he was the one who constantly created miracles and turned the situation around in this war. What kind of experience did such a person have to go through to have such formidable strength today? Some of the more cowardly warriors even collapsed to the ground. Xiao Yang's appearance could be said to be at the right time. In addition to the momentum created by breaking the formation with a single sword, it made people feel that he was like a god who had descended to the mortal world. With so many thoughts, even more people could not help but feel terrified and tremble. Bai Cheng's expression suddenly changed, and he shouted angrily, "Stop bluffing. If you really have that kind of strength, you would have come to take my head long ago." Ever since Bai Xingyun stepped into half a step to rank 5, he was the most powerful person in the Bai tribe. Therefore, if Xiao Yang could really kill him, wouldn't it be easier and easier for him to kill Bai Cheng? After many people thought of this reason, a glimmer of hope rose in their hearts again. How could they be scared by words? Chapter 2364. Facing such a question, Xiao Yang was still very calm, because it was the truth to him. There was no need to argue about it. Moreover, he did indeed have the ability to kill Bai Cheng. However, this was a war, not a one-on-one fight. Therefore, it was still somewhat difficult for him to directly charge over. Xiao Yang waved the divine sword in his hand and said, "Let's try and you'll know. However, old bastard, do you dare to fight with me?" After he finished speaking, Xiao Yang's lips curled into an extremely disdainful smile. The provocation in his words was even more obvious. Following that, the aura around Xiao Yang's body started to increase rapidly. Since he had shown up, he naturally had to show his strength. Only in this way could he make his opponent tremble in fear. Sometimes, a few words could not achieve the goal of frightening people. More often than not, he would use his own strength to inform them, which would make them even more terrified, to the point where they would not even dare to think of fighting against him. As Xiao Yang's aura skyrocketed, Bai Cheng could not help but frown. He clearly felt that Xiao Yang's cultivation had reached the 3rd level martial royal realm. Previously, Princess Mingzhu fought with him with the cultivation of the 3rd level martial royal realm and almost lost her life. Xiao Yang was a 3rd order martial emperor, and he wasn't any weaker than that girl. When he thought of this, the fear in Bai Cheng's heart grew even more. There were too many tricks in this. Moreover, that girl had not shown up until now. So where was she hiding? Or was she hiding somewhere, ready to give him a fatal blow at any time? With so much information gathered together, Bai Cheng could not help but think more. Otherwise, if he made a wrong move, he might lose his life. Therefore, how could he not be cautious? Bai Cheng's eyes flickered again, hoping to find some clues. Xiao Yang, how long can you be arrogant? If you don't go back now, I'm afraid that North Light City, 100 Prosperity City, and Extreme Yang Sect have already fallen. Bai Cheng suddenly changed the topic. Since the war had already progressed to this extent, everything had already begun. Therefore, these arrangements could no longer be kept a secret. Therefore, using words to force him to retreat was the best choice. Of course, his words were more of a probe than anything else. Hearing these words, Mu Yang and Luo Ji looked at each other and smiled. This group of idiots thought that their methods were brilliant, but little did they know that Xiaoyang was aware of their every move. Moreover, he was able to react in time, causing them to be defeated and lose their lives along the way. Xiaoyang seemed to be a little impatient. He waved his hand and said, "You're talking about those small teams. I think there are only a few people who are still alive." When these words came out, Bai Cheng could not help but frown. Looking at Xiaoyang's incomparably calm expression, he did not seem to be lying. But what exactly was the situation? The team from Spring Sun City was not even 100 miles away before they were all killed by me. I also killed everyone who went to the Dark Night, Holy Land along the way. Xiaoyang said with a smile. When these words came out, Bai Cheng's eyes instantly widened. Such news made it difficult for him to calm down again. But why did he not receive any news at all? Such a huge change. But he did not know anything? Bai Cheng still felt that it was a little unbelievable. However, the route that Xiaoyang mentioned was extremely accurate, so he had no choice but to believe it. If he didn't really understand it, he naturally wouldn't know it so clearly. Moreover, Xiaoyang was able to return quickly after killing those two teams. Then how fast was his speed? Now, Bai Cheng's heart was indeed starting to panic, because everything that had happened was inconceivable to him. The variables within were even more unexpected. But how did Xiaoyang know these things so clearly? Could it be that there was a traitor in the White Bear tribe? Suddenly, Bai Cheng turned his head to look at Bai Lingluan, because most of the details were planned by him. There were even some routes that were forcefully requested. When Bai Lingluan was looked at like this, he could not help but feel guilty. Being looked at like this by the ancestor, anyone would probably start to wonder what they had done wrong. Then, Bai Cheng suddenly reached out and grabbed Bai Lingluan's neck with one hand. He lifted him up and looked at him furiously. Immediately, everyone could not help but be shocked. What was going on? "Speak, did you betray us?" Bai Cheng asked angrily. Bai Lingluan struggled to shake his head and said, "Ancestor, how could I do such a thing? You must not believe the words of those humans who are trying to sow discord." Xiaoyang was not in a hurry to make a move. He only watched quietly. He did not expect the internal conflict of the White Bear tribe to be so serious. It was even difficult for everyone to be of one mind. The situation of mutual suspicion was also quite serious. However, Xiaoyang did not understand what the other party was planning. However, his aura had also reached its peak. Furthermore, he had also made his preparations. Soon, he would be able to make his move and fight. Now, Bai Cheng could not get off the tiger because he felt that the current situation was very bad. But he could not leave. If he fled with his army because of Xiaoyang's appearance, he would not be able to raise his head when he returned to the myriad beast realm. Even the entire White Bear tribe would be humiliated. Now, Bai Cheng's heart was filled with shock and anger. He did not expect so many changes to have happened while he was hesitating. Bai Cheng also did not understand what had happened to cause such a drastic change in the situation. They could have crushed him, but in the end they fell into a quagmire and could not extricate themselves. Could it be that he was old and muddle-headed, and under his command, this awkward situation was caused? Bai Cheng was also thinking about this in his heart, but he could not come up with an answer that satisfied him. In fact, there were more and more doubts. What had he done in this war? Judging from the results, each of his decisions seemed to be very bad. Otherwise, how could the White Bear tribe's losses be so serious? Suddenly, Bai Cheng became ruthless and directly strangled Bai Lingluan to death. Bai Lingluan colluded with the Drifting Cloud Realm. Today, we will fight to the death and take down the Drifting Cloud Realm. Chapter 2365. Mu Yang and Luo Ji stood on high ground. When they saw Bai Lingluan's head fall to the ground, they were dumbfounded. They naturally knew that they didn't have any spies in the White Bear tribe. However, this old bastard was so decisive in killing his own people. This was somewhat unexpected. It had to be said that a bastard was a bastard. When he attacked, he didn't hold back at all. However, as Bai Cheng's words fell, the White Bear tribe's warriors, who were originally dispirited, began to feel their spirits rise. All of their blood boiled as they looked at Xiaoyang and the flowing cloud realm with hatred. The reason why the White Bear tribe fell to such a state was all because of these cunning humans. It was also because of them that their own tribesmen betrayed them and died. Only by killing them all would they be able to vent the hatred in their hearts. Bai Cheng immediately reverted to his true form. He tossed Bai Lingluan's corpse aside and prepared to give it his all. Since they had already reached such a stage, he had no way out. He could only fight. If he won, he would still have a chance to turn the tables. If he lost, there was nothing he could do. Of course, Bai Cheng felt that since he had already reached such a stage, there was no reason for him to lose. As for Princess Mingzhu, who hadn't shown herself yet, Bai Cheng already had a plan in mind. Most likely, the experts from Mountain Master Pinsheng had already gone to kill those small teams. Since everyone's strength was spread out, then they would go all out and see who would have the last laugh. In an instant, the White Bear tribe's warriors became even more violent. There were even low roars coming out. The roars were like thunder, deafening to the ears. Xiaoyang stood with his sword in hand. Seeing the sudden change in the situation, he could only laugh bitterly. This old bastard still had some tricks up his sleeve. Under this kind of manipulation, he actually made the morale reach its peak. Originally, he wanted to weaken the opponent's morale and make them fall to the bottom. That way, he could easily end the battle. However, it seemed that this was still going to be a tough battle. Some of the warriors who were closer to Xiaoyang even activated charge. It was as if their lives were no longer important to them. They only had one goal, and that was to crush this rock that was blocking their path. This was also the terrifying aspect of dire beasts. Once their brains were filled with blood, they would completely lose their rationality. In fact, it was normal for them to disregard their reputation. At this moment, Luo Ji and Mu Yang were already prepared. Xiaoyang was alone in the midst of the enemy's formation. Even though he was extremely powerful, it would still be extremely difficult for him to fight. No matter how strong he was, he would not be able to hold his own against such a huge army. However, in the next moment, Luo Ji and Mu Yang's aura softened because they had received Xiaoyang's orders. The two of them were not allowed to leave the mountain. They had to ensure the safety of the formation so that not even a White Bear warrior could invade. Although they were really anxious in their hearts, they had never questioned Xiaoyang's orders. Right now, Xiaoyang was in charge of the situation. His orders were the highest order, and they had to follow them. It could be said that the reason why the Flowing Cloud Realm was able to contend with the White Bear tribe until now was because Xiaoyang had made the most reasonable arrangements every time. Otherwise, the Flowing Cloud Realm would have fallen long ago. As the countless white bears galloped, even the ground began to tremble. The rumbling sounds were even more powerful and shocking. Xiaoyang gripped his divine sword tightly. Even for him, dealing with so many people was extremely difficult. However, he could not take even half a step back because he had to use the sword in his hand to cut this force in half. Otherwise, under such a powerful attack, the Flowing Cloud Realm would fall directly. Bai Cheng stood in the distance. When he saw that Xiaoyang's expression was no longer as calm as before, a trace of a smile appeared at the corner of his mouth. Since I may not be your opponent in a one-on-one fight, then I will use the most elite warriors to take your life. Yi Shiwen thought to himself. This was also Bai Cheng's plan. Moreover, this method was the safest. Everyone, all cultivators in the 3rd level of the Martial Royal Realm will come with me to kill Xiaoyang. As long as he dies, the Flowing Cloud Realm will be at our fingertips. Bai Cheng ordered again. The cultivators standing beside him all nodded. Those who did not meet the requirements rushed to the Flowing Cloud Realm. Now, their division of labor was very clear. In addition, because of their rage, their combat strength was even more powerful and difficult to ignore. Xiao Yang slashed out with his sword. Suddenly, under the surging sword chi, the first few people who rushed forward were cut into pieces in the blink of an eye. However, this was only the beginning. The white bear warriors followed closely behind. It was like a monstrous wave that could not be resisted at all. Now, these guys were not afraid of death. In fact, each of them was even more ferocious than the other. In the situation where their blood was completely stimulated, their ability to erupt was multiplied. As for their predecessors being cut into pieces, they were not afraid because of it. Instead, it made their bestial nature even stronger. When Luo Ji and Mu Yang saw the momentum of the attack, they could not help but suck in a breath of cold air. If they were in that place, they would not be able to hold on for long and would die there. However, Xiao Yang was different. Everything seemed to be proceeding in an orderly manner. No matter how strong the charging was, he did not retreat half a step. In fact, a 30-feet radius around him had already formed a sword barrier, protecting him in the center. However, in the face of such an attack, even though Xiao Yang's methods were powerful, after a few waves, he was still forced to take a few steps back. Such momentum could be said to be incomparably terrifying. Now, the White Bear army had completely lost their minds. They only cared about charging forward. As for life and death, they did not care about it at all. They did not even think about it. Now, Xiao Yang could be said to be suffering unspeakable. He had calculated a lot before, but until now he had still miscalculated. Although he could calculate human nature, he was still lacking in the calculation of bestial nature. At this time, the White Bear army should be incomparably depressed. However, now they were angry and excited. When Bai Cheng saw the situation, he was also overjoyed. Now that the situation was set and Xiao Yang was completely suppressed, it was the best time to kill him. Xiao Yang was the backbone of the drifting cloud boundary. As long as he was killed, no one would be able to stop his advance. Chapter 2366. Even though Xiao Yang had the ability to kill the group of white bears in an instant, that was only when it was one-on-one. However, there were countless white bears attacking at this moment, and it was true that he was feeling powerless. Unless one's cultivation was enough to suppress an entire world, it would be difficult to withstand such an attack. However, Xiao Yang was still holding on bitterly because he knew very well that if he held on for a while longer, the impact on Pine Victory Mountain behind him would be much smaller. At the very least, before they returned, the defense of the summit Victory Mountain was already a little inadequate. Therefore, how could Xiao Yang retreat just like that? Moreover, there were countless pairs of eyes staring at him with anticipation on the mountain, which made it even more impossible for him to take half a step back. However, in the face of such an attack, Xiao Yang still kept retreating. Even though there were several people who lost their lives under the sword encirclement every time, the warriors of the White Bear tribe seemed to have gone mad. They didn't care about their own lives at all as they attacked crazily. Xiao Yang felt a little helpless in his heart. Of course, he also wanted to mobilize his men to fight with real swords and spears, but now wasn't the time. No matter what, the most important thing now was to protect Pine Victory Mountain and preserve his own strength as much as possible. That was the most important thing. This was also a plan for the counterattack later on. Of course, it was also for the sake of having enough strength to fight back against the full-scale invasion of the Wanshou realm in the future. If they suffered serious losses at the beginning, it would really be difficult to resist later on. Xiao Yang knew which was more important in his heart. Therefore, how could he not think more and wait a little longer? On the contrary, Bai Cheng felt very comfortable looking at the scene before him. He couldn't understand why Xiao Yang would waste his strength like that, wanting to stop the attack of the entire army by himself. However, in Bai Cheng's eyes, he felt that it was a really good thing. In this way, they could exhaust Xiao Yang to death. As long as he fell, the hardest bone in the drifting cloud realm would shatter. Until now, Bai Cheng still couldn't understand. Even he couldn't understand what was going on. He might be able to understand Bai Wuxi's death, but Bai Xingyun's death was even more puzzling to him. That was a half step into the Fifth Order. How could it disappear just like that? Furthermore, the current Xiaoyang appeared to be completely unharmed. Thinking about this, Bai Cheng also felt that this matter was full of strangeness. Even now, he was unwilling to believe that Bai Xingyun was gone. He felt that there was only one possibility, and that was that Bai Xingyun was trapped and unable to escape. Old ancestor, if we continue to fight like this, the number of elites under our sect will decrease. A scarred man stood out and said in a low voice, even though only a few white bears would lose their lives under each impact, it was still not enough. However, the impact never stopped. Within a short period of time, there were mountains of corpses and seas of blood beneath Xiaoyang's feet. Regarding this, Scarface felt incomparable heartache. Most of them were at the pinnacle of Kingwu. Furthermore, there was no lack of geniuses who could step into the martial emperor realm. However, under such a frenzied attack, it was as if they were sending themselves to their deaths. This made Scarface feel even more pained. It was not a good idea to continue fighting like this. However, Bai Cheng's gaze was still extremely cold, as if everything that was happening had nothing to do with him. It was impossible for Bai Cheng not to feel heartache. After all, they were all great men under his sect, and would be the backbone of the sect in the future. However, this old monster felt even more heartache for his own life. He felt that it was worth it to use so many pinnacle of Kingwu to exchange for a common leader. At the very least, he would be able to wear down as much of his opponent's strength as possible. As for other matters, what was there to worry about? Furthermore, as long as they took down the Four Realms Alliance with the confidence of the White Bear tribe, they would still be able to create such a group of people. In fact, those who could survive this war were bound to be the heroes of the age. Heroes were born in troubled times. This had always been the case. Those who could survive after experiencing blood and fire would definitely be outstanding existences in all aspects. Scarface saw that the old ancestor did not have any reaction, and became even more anxious. He really could not figure out what the old ancestor's purpose was. Furthermore, they had a few third-level martial emperors here. Why were they not willing to let them fight? However, only Bai Cheng was aware of the restraining fear within this. After all, Xiaoyang was able to quickly take care of Bailey Wei and Bailey Shang. This was enough to show that he was invincible in the same realm. If they were to send out their top forces, and the opponent seized the opportunity, the consequences would be terrible. On Summit Victory Mountain, Ji Fei coordinated the formation very well. There was not a single mistake in every step. As for the old Prime Minister and King Zhao, they were patching up the gaps at the side. Those who charged through Xiaoyang's defense line and survived all rushed towards Summit Victory Mountain. This kind of attack could be said to be extremely crazy. Mu Yang and Luo Ji had not made a move yet, but their hearts were already extremely conflicted. They did not receive any orders, and could only watch as Xiaoyang was knocked back. Even that layer of sword defense seemed to be on the verge of collapsing. Mu Yang could not do anything about this. Military orders were like mountains. Since they had received an order, they had to strictly follow it. Even though they understood Xiaoyang's intentions as friends, they felt that it was extremely unkind of them to just watch. However, for the sake of the overall situation and the final victory, they did not dare to act rashly. It seemed that the only way out was to continue waiting. Under such circumstances, the two of them felt even more uncomfortable. Even though they were in the same realm, the pressure they had to endure was very different. Fellow Taoist Muyang, are we really just going to watch and do nothing? I don't think sect leader Xiao is a petty person, right? Luo Ji asked in a probing tone. Luo Ji could not bear it anymore, so he wanted to ask for Mu Yang's opinion. If the two of them attacked together, even if Xiaoyang blamed them, they could bear the responsibility together. After a long struggle, Muyang said in a low voice, "Trust him. We just need to watch summit Victory Mountain. When Princess Mingzhu arrives, it won't be too late for us to make a move." Muyang gritted his teeth in pain. Chapter 2367. If it was before, Muyang would have attacked without hesitation. However, that was only limited to the battles in the underworld. What was happening now was a war. Perhaps a small mistake could lead to defeat, and the entire world might be enslaved by someone else. It was because of this that Muyang had become extremely calm, since Xiaoyang had to consider the big picture even though he was under so much pressure. How could they act on impulse? As such, listening to orders was the best choice. If Xiaoyang really could not withstand the attack of the army, they would naturally not stand by and do nothing. However, at least for now, there was no need for them to do anything. As such, there was no need for them to do anything unnecessary to prevent messing up the situation. Facing the White Bear's attacks, Xiaoyang was continuously pushed back, and he was less than 3 kilometers away from Taste Victory Mountain. After retreating to this point, Xiaoyang felt that he couldn't retreat any further. Otherwise, his aura might affect the Triumph Mountain's array formation. Regarding this, Xiaoyang was not so pessimistic. After all, under such an attack, his cultivation began to become denser. Polishing like this would allow him to achieve twice the results with half the effort. In front of an army, a person would have many ideas. However, it would be difficult to turn some ideas into a situation that one could accept. However, Xiaoyang had managed to do it. This was not easy to come by. Of course, there was another possibility, which was that Xiaoyang had always liked to cultivate in battle, so he was very familiar with it this time. In fact, it could be said that he was like a fish in water, and it was very easy for him. As they retreated, the path was filled with corpses. There were even countless broken limbs and remains. At the foot of Taste Victory Mountain, blood flowed like a river, and the smell of blood soared into the sky, shocking everyone. "Ancestor, we can't continue like this." Scarface roared anxiously. More and more soldiers fell, and 10% of them died at Xiaoyang's hands. If this kind of attack continued, then their losses would only continue to increase. In the eyes of the Scarface man, such a reckless charge was a complete waste of his men's lives. Such a method could be said to be extremely irrational. It could even be said that he was asking them to rush to their deaths. At the same time, Scarface's heart was filled with incomparable fear. This Xiaoyang was truly a monster. Even in the face of such an attack, he was still able to fight a bloody battle without retreating. It was really hard to imagine what kind of cultivation method he had used to actually make his cultivation and strength so strong to such an extent. In their eyes, Xiaoyang's monstrous demeanor didn't seem like a human cultivator at all. "Then why don't you charge into the formation?" Bai Cheng's face suddenly darkened as he shouted. Scarface's expression immediately became extremely ugly. It was as if he had eaten **T. Scarface was only a level 1 martial king. With his cultivation, he was nothing in front of Xiaoyang. Therefore, if he charged into the formation, he would only end up dead. However, the ancestor had already given the order. How could he disobey? Scarface gritted his teeth as he thought of this, and said, "Fine." Since he couldn't persuade the ancestor with words, Scarface only had one way to go, and that was to charge in together. That was the only way to wake the ancestor up. If he could exchange his own life for the lives of his fellow clansmen, Scarface felt that it was very worth it. As soon as he finished speaking, Scarface had already charged out. Scarface knew that there was a dead end ahead, but he still charged forward. Sometimes a price had to be paid in order for some people to see reality clearly. Seeing Scarface charge forward, Bai Cheng couldn't help but be stunned. He had only said it in a fit of anger. He didn't expect this kid to take it seriously. "Since you're courting death, there's no need to stop you." Scarface quickly rushed into the crowd and disappeared without a trace. However, his aura was incomparably strong. His huge original form was even more tyrannical. However, in the next moment, Scarface's entire body burned with flames. In the blink of an eye, he was engulfed by the spiritual fire. Immediately after, the spiritual fire spread rapidly and formed a wall of fire, isolating Xiaoyang from the outside world. At this point, Xiaoyang was almost unable to hold on. Therefore, he had no choice but to summon Xiaohua to help. Otherwise, if he continued to fight like this, he would be exhausted more and more. In the end, it might even be difficult for him to continue fighting. The final battle had not arrived yet. Therefore, Xiaoyang had to conserve his strength to a certain extent so that he wouldn't be unable to continue when the time came. After Xiaohua attacked, his power was instantly strong. Under his full strength, he forcefully swallowed a Martial King powerhouse and even digested him. This scene caused everyone to be even more dumbfounded. They never thought that the power of this spiritual fire would actually become even stronger than the last time. After Xiaohua swallowed by Xinyan's body, his strength had increased again. Now, Xiaohua could even fight a 4th-level Martial King powerhouse. In the face of so many foreign species, Lil Flame was even more excited. This was because these invaders were the best nourishment for him. If he could completely engulf it, what kind of change would his strength undergo? This was the terrifying characteristic of Xiaohua. As long as he swallowed anything with spiritual energy, he could convert it into his own power. Back then, when Xiaohua was severely injured, it took Xiaohua several years to completely swallow it. During this time, there were even a few accidents. If Xiaoyang hadn't intervened in time, Xiaohua would have been devoured by him. At this moment, Bai Cheng's aura exploded once again. This was the moment he had been waiting for. Previously, Xiaoyang was brave and strong. He wasn't confident that he could fight him. However, after being attacked by thousands of troops, Xiaoyang's strength was almost depleted. The only proof was that he had summoned the spiritual fire. If he hadn't been at the end of his rope, how could he have done this? Since Xiaoyang was physically and mentally exhausted, it was the best time for Bai Cheng to make his move. In war, there was no glory to speak of. Only victory could explain everything. The winner was king. Chapter 2368. The 3 of you will work together to restrain that spiritual fire. Stop it from doing whatever it wants and obstructing our army's attack. Bai Cheng ordered. Immediately, the 3 Third Order Martial Emperors obeyed the order and charged towards the spiritual fire. In a battle, once an order was given, it had to be carried out. There was no room for doubt. Everyone who had experienced countless battles understood that they had to carry out an order even if it was a wrong one. Only in this way could the whole army be united. If they hesitated at a critical moment, they might miss the opportunity. The 2 of you will kill Xiaoyang with me. The rest of you will rush to the Victory Mountain. You must take him down quickly without any mistakes. Bai Cheng said angrily, "Yes, sir." Immediately, the martial kings who were still waiting began to rub their palms together. They had waited for so long, and now they finally had the chance to show off their skills. Xiaoyang had made it clear that they would divide their forces to stop the other teams. In addition, Xiaoyang was fighting against thousands of troops alone. It showed how weak the defense of the Victory Mountain was. If they could take down the Victory Mountain in this battle, it would not be a loss. If they could kill Xiaoyang as well, then they would be able to obtain a complete victory and take over the entire Flowing Cloud world. In order to be more thorough, they would wait for the rest of the tribe to arrive and take down the 4-realm alliance in one go. It seemed that a great change had occurred in their originally muddy situation. Because the White Bear tribe had a lot of experts, it was very easy for them to coordinate with each other. They could make countless mistakes, but the Drifting Cloud realm only needed one mistake to fall into an irrecoverable situation. This was the battle between the strong and the weak. The latter was helpless, no matter how many steps were taken. Once there was a mistake, there was no turning back. In the next moment, under the change of orders, everyone began to carry out their orders. Bai Yuan and Bai Liduan followed, closely behind Bai Cheng. At the same time, they were already prepared. As long as Xiaoyang showed any weakness, they could immediately catch up and kill him. Xiaoyang, your end is here. Bai Cheng shouted angrily and rushed forward. Under the encirclement of the three martial emperors, Xiaohua also began to shrink back and flee in all directions. Facing the encirclement of three martial emperors, Xiaohua seemed to be somewhat powerless. In addition, Xiaoyang had also changed his instructions. All he needed to do was to stall the three martial emperors. As for the other matters, he would leave them to them. While Xiaohua was fleeing, he was still able to find the time to kill some warriors. This made the martial emperors extremely angry. At this moment, Pine Victory Mountain also felt a great pressure. Faced with the other party's full-powered attack, all the martial monarchs could only bitterly endure. Right now, the pressure Ji Fei was under was even greater. Even though the 10,000 Hearts United formation gave him an endless supply of energy, it was still difficult for him to take care of everything. Looks like the two of us are unable to continue preserving our strength. Luoji laughed. Mu Yang also smiled and nodded. Looking at the attack below, which was like a mad dog, he also felt helpless. From this information, they were very clear that the White Bear tribe was doing this because they wanted to give it their all. As long as they could hold on for a while longer, they could wait for Princess Mingzhu to arrive and counterattack. Let's show these bastards how strong we are. Mu Yang laughed disdainfully. As long as Bai Cheng did not attack, the two of them were not afraid in a one-on-one fight. Moreover, the other party's experts of the same cultivation level were all restrained by Xiaoyang and Xiaohua. There were almost no cultivators who could pose a threat to them. Therefore, in the blink of an eye, they suddenly understood what to do. What Mu Yang and Luo Ji needed to do was to help Pine Victory Mountain as much as possible. If they could kill some martial emperors, then they would. If they could not, then there was no need to force it. Their goal was still pure, which was to protect Pine Victory Mountain. Previously, Xiaoyang did not let them attack because he was afraid that the other party would attack like a mad dog. At that time, if Ji Fei and the others could not hold on and the formation was broken, without such a natural barrier, Pine Victory Mountain would be in danger. Moreover, the strategic significance of Pine Victory Mountain was different. This was the true first line of defense and also the last line of defense. Once this place was breached, it would be very difficult for them to continue this war. Luo Ji stood on the left and immediately shouted. Layers of frost began to spread around his body. In an instant, with him as the center, a huge ice field appeared. As he slammed his palm down, countless pieces of ice turned into snowflakes and floated down. These snowflakes looked weak, but they were extremely sharp. Once a cultivator below the martial emperor realm was hit, they would either die or be seriously injured. On the other side, Mu Yang also activated the Vermilion Flame token. Instantly, 3 flames alternated. The 3 flames were like 3 fire dragons. Everywhere they passed, people were plunged into misery and suffering. The 2 of them, one on the left and one on the right, killed the enemies on both sides until they threw away their helmets and abandoned their armor. Of course, this was only temporary. Very quickly, martial emperors came up and began to restrict the 2 of them. Boom! Under Bai Cheng's fist, Xiaoyang's sword defense was smashed into pieces. Bai Cheng led the 2 of them forward. He looked like he was closing in on Xiaoyang step by step. He wanted to kill Xiaoyang. Kid, you are strong. Normal people cannot compare to you. However, your world is too weak. No matter how strong you are, it is useless. Today, you will not escape death. Bai Cheng shouted angrily. Now, Bai Cheng's murderous intent was completely exposed. He knew very well that this was a great opportunity to kill Xiaoyang. Moreover, he did not know when that woman would arrive. Therefore, he had to kill him now to prevent any more trouble. As long as he could kill Xiaoyang first, he would be able to use the same method to make that woman die with hatred. I did not think that you would dare to make a move. I thought you would hide in the back and not step out of your formation," Xiaoyang said. The corner of his lips curled up and he looked very proud. It was as if everything was within Xiaoyang's plan. What he did before was to lure the snake out of its hole and let Bai Cheng deliver himself to him. After all, it would be difficult for him to kill his way in and take down Bai Cheng alone. In an instant, Bai Cheng could no longer remain calm. He felt like this was a trap. Chapter 2369. Currently, Bai Cheng's heart was filled with complex emotions. He never thought that this was a trap that Xiaoyang was purposely showing weakness to bait him into making a move. Thinking of this, Bai Cheng's heart was somewhat unsettled. If that was really the case, then he would be trapped in this situation. He was afraid that in the end he would have to face the other party's scheme. No matter how you look at it, he was too careless. Bai Yuan and Bai Liduan, on the other hand, were a little fearful. After all, they had come this far. If they retreated now, what would they do? If they retreated, it would affect the others. When that happens, the aggressive attacks that they worked so hard to gather will be destroyed. At that time, they would most likely be defeated in this battle. The more he thought about it, the more worried Bai Yuan became. But before this moody ancestor, he didn't dare to say anything. He could only keep it to himself. Since the ancestor killed Bai Lingluan to inspire everyone's fighting spirit, he might do the same to Bai Yuan for his own selfish reasons. Therefore, even if Bai Yuan wanted to, he had to keep it to himself to avoid getting himself into trouble. Right now, Bai Cheng did have some thoughts of retreating in his heart, but this thought was quickly swept away. He knew very well that there was no way out for him now. If he retreated, the consequences would be extremely terrible for him. The arrow was shot out. How could he turn back? If he stopped halfway, then the consequences would be even more terrifying. Therefore, Bai Cheng had no choice but to fight. No matter what, he had no way out. Therefore, he had no choice. You are just trying to be mysterious. You want to use words to force me to retreat? Do you think that's possible? Bai Cheng forced himself to breathe and scolded. Even though he knew there was a hole in front of him, he had to jump into it. The situation forced him to do so. As for whether or not Xiaoyang was trying to be mysterious, that remained to be seen. After all, they had to think about this carefully. Xiaoyang said, "If you think so, then so be it." As he spoke, Xiaoyang appeared very calm. It was as if everything was within his calculations. There was no mistake at all. He couldn't see any flaws, which made Bai Cheng feel even more uneasy. At the same time, he began to search quickly in his mind, trying to analyze the information he had obtained before. But now, he realized that he knew very little about Xiaoyang. In fact, it was not an exaggeration to say that it was pitifully small. Under such circumstances, could he really fight with him? Such doubts caused him to hesitate once again. Even though the battle cries were incessant and the smell of blood was everywhere, he still remained calm. However, such calmness also made him wary and afraid. Then Bai Cheng changed his mind. Even if Xiaoyang had reached the third-order martial emperor realm, so what? There was still a gap between the two of them. Moreover, there were two capable experts by his side. If they did not dare to fight with him, even with such cooperation, how cowardly would they be? You're really scheming. I almost believed you. Bai Cheng snorted coldly and scolded. In the next moment, Bai Cheng did not want to continue talking and directly launched an attack. At this point, Bai Cheng was very clear that the more he spoke, the more he would lose his confidence. By then, it would be difficult for him to fight. Therefore, it was better to be decisive. Whether it was true or not, he would only know after the fight. Now, even if he said more to test him, he was afraid that he would not be satisfied with the result. All of them were old foxes. So why should they do something meaningless? As for how strong the other party was, he would only know after probing the other party. At this moment, Bai Yuan and Bai Liduan secretly heaved a sigh of relief. Since the ancestor was not muddle-headed, that was the best news. As long as he dared to attack, the opportunity to win would naturally appear. They wanted to see how powerful Xiaoyang, who had created miracles time and time again, was. Previously, they had heard a lot about him. However, those were just rumors. Seeing was not believing. Seeing Bai Cheng charging towards him, Xiaoyang snorted coldly in disdain. He had already figured out the mentality of this old man. He looked very decisive, but he was just testing. With such a mentality, even if he attacked, it would be meaningless and he would not be able to turn the situation around. Xiaoyang waved the divine sword in his hand. Instantly, he took a deep breath and charged over. Now, Xiaoyang's goal was very simple. The only person who could pose a threat to them was Bai Cheng. Once he killed him, the last bit of strength that the White Bear tribe could bring out would be gone. By then, the war between them and the White Bear tribe would come to an end. As for what kind of trouble they would face in the future, that was a matter for the future. It was not something they could worry about now. With a slash of the sword, a flaming sword chi that was dozens of feet tall was instantly invincible. Bai Cheng could not help but suck in a breath of cold air when he saw the sword chi. Judging from the might, he was able to sense that his opponent was holding back. Could it be that he didn't lose much strength from the previous attack? Thinking of this, Bai Cheng felt that his approach was a little hasty. If he could wait a little longer, maybe things would change. However, in the next second, Bai Cheng's opinion changed again. The reason for that was because that strand of sword aura had been shattered by a single punch. Therefore, the sword chi only felt strong. In reality, there was nothing powerful about it. Bai Yuan and Bai Liduan saw this and couldn't help but feel sad. Perhaps Xiaoyang was only as powerful as the rumors made him out to be. Most of his abilities were exaggerated. At least based on what they saw, the abilities he displayed were far from what the rumors said. Thinking about this, Bai Yuan and Bai Liduan became more courageous. Plus, the ancestor was attacking. What did they have to be afraid of? Therefore, the two of them moved. They started to attack from both sides and prepared to attack from both sides. Though Xiaoyang's abilities did not seem like much, they didn't dare to be careless. As long as they could kill him quickly, it would be enough. Only the dead would not give rise to any variables. If you want to pretend to be a pig to eat a tiger, then kill the pig while you're pretending. Chapter 2370. Seeing how everyone's expressions had changed and how their mentality had changed, Xiaoyang chuckled to himself. He was afraid that they would be too cautious to make a move. As long as they fight, nobody will be able to escape. Even if he managed to escape, he would still have to pay a price for it. As long as he could guarantee that he would not suffer any losses in this battle, it would be fine. Therefore, all of this was within Xiaoyang's calculations. As for the lack of stamina, that was a problem that would never occur. He had used his position as the leader of this place to restore his energy to its peak. After all, this place was like Xiaoyang's own little world. This was where his victory lay. Bai Cheng was still charging forward as if he didn't sense the danger. Sometimes some small details were enough to make a big change in people's mentality. Break! Xiaoyang growled. He swung the heavenly sword in his hand again, and multiple rays of sword energy shot out. Although the sword chi looked ferocious, it was actually very soft. Therefore, Bai Cheng had nothing to worry about. Therefore, when he made his move, he was very careful and didn't hesitate at all. In Bai Cheng's eyes, Xiaoyang was merely an arrow at the end of its flight. He didn't fall because he was holding on with one breath. Plus, none of this was important. As long as he could kill him, everything would end. Ray after ray of sword energy landed on his body. Bai Cheng felt like they were soft and useless. They couldn't even break through his physical defense. They were like scratching an itch. Bai Cheng's fist landed on Xiaoyang's chest. He lost control of himself and was knocked far away. Bai Yuan stood up and charged forward. He was ready to end this battle right now and end Xiaoyang's life first. But suddenly, an ice sword fell, and White Abyss's forward momentum immediately stopped. After the ice sword landed, it immediately exploded like a blooming lotus. Every single petal was like an icicle that scattered in all directions. Bai Yuan quickly retreated and was not injured by such a technique. However, the disciples around them, even the unluckier ones, had their hearts pierced through and lost their lives on the spot. Soon after, Bai Yuan lifted his head to look at the ice field above. His brows furrowed even more. It seemed that there were many hidden dragons and crouching tigers in the Four Realms Alliance. Who knows where an almighty person would appear? Even in the white abyss, if he were to fight with the one above, it would be almost impossible to take him down in a one-on-one situation. Luo Ji only glanced sideways at Xiaoyang. After the crisis was resolved, she placed more of her attention on the main battlefield. Luo Ji did not know why Xiaoyang had suddenly become so weak. However, he knew that this was not Xiaogong Zhu's true strength. As for what he was planning, no one knew. However, one thing was certain, and that was that Xiaoyang was not a superficial person. It was also impossible for him to change his entire outlook on the big picture just because his brain was damaged. Therefore, he most likely did this for a purpose or a reason. When Bai Cheng saw this scene, many thoughts and schemes appeared in his mind. Why was Xiaoyang so weak now? This was indeed a question worth pondering. Could it be that he was seriously injured by Xingyun and has never recovered? Earlier, he was just trying to scare me away by putting on a show of strength. Who knows? Maybe the information he revealed before was just nonsense. Bai Cheng thought in his heart and suddenly became a lot more excited. If that was the case, then how could the Victory Mountain not fall today? Bai Cheng was also very helpless. He almost fell into this little guy's trap. If they were really scared off by his despicable methods, then it would be a joke if word got out. Xiaoyang slowly got up from the ground and even coughed out a mouthful of blood. The power of the punch he received just now was indeed not to be underestimated. Even his internal organs had been beaten to the point that they were slightly displaced. Fortunately, this was not a big deal. He would be able to recover in a short time. There was nothing Mu Yang could do about it. He had no idea what the kid was up to. However, it was fine to just watch. There was no need to think so much. Because of trust, they would not suspect anything. However, as the general attack began, the situation of the Victory Mountain became even more desperate. Some of the barriers at the foot of the mountain were even broken. The warriors from both sides began to engage in close combat. The warriors who went out to fight all used the explosive pill to raise their strength by a level. However, the White Bear tribe's army was a ferocious beast, so they had a natural advantage. Especially when they were in a berserk state, it was very obvious. Cruel, bloodthirsty, and valiant. Even in the same realm, 3 warriors were needed to fight 1 White Bear tribe warrior. If there were less than this number, they would be at a disadvantage. After the ferocious beast revealed its true form, its advantage was completely displayed. It was very terrifying. Under its rough skin and thick flesh, it was difficult to break through its defense. The situation at the foot of the mountain also became more and more anxious and terrifying. It was as if the war would never stop. Fortunately, the Allied army was united. Every time one of their comrades fell, someone would quickly rush over to fill in the gap, preventing the enemy from tearing it apart. However, this kind of perseverance still seemed to be somewhat helpless. Even now, Xiao Changsheng personally came over to supervise the battle, to prevent the gap from getting bigger. Xin Fian, Chu Taiyin, and the others also went to the foot of the mountain. They all knew that the defensive formations at those places were weaker and needed manpower to guard them. Perhaps it was because of this that some of the more observant people had discovered this flaw. At the same time, they began to arrange for people to attack those places that seemed weaker. After all, as long as there was a chance, they had to grab it. There were many opportunities. Once missed, there would not be another in the future. Attacking the 10,000 Hearts United formation head-on could be said to be the stupidest thing to do. However, they had no other choice. Now that an opportunity had appeared, they naturally had to test it out. At the same time, on the mountain peak, a cultivator with a sword on his back floated down and looked forward. Chapter 2371. After Xiaoyang, Li Fengmu was the second person to complete his mission quickly. He even rested along the way to recover his strength. Baldi and Qin Mingho were at the back. This was because their speed was much slower than Li Fengmu's. Seeing Li Fengmu's return, Ji Fei, who was in charge of the formation, secretly heaved a sigh of relief. The pressure he felt now was too great, and he didn't know how long he could hold on. However, with Li Fengmu's return, there was a limit to their time. If the Qin King and Princess Mingzhu were to return, then they could charge out and fight the White Bear tribe to the death. Li Fengmu looked ahead, coldly, and frowned. According to the plan, Xiaoyang had to wait for them to return before taking action. Moreover, he had to wait for an opportunity to kill Bai Cheng in one blow. Only then would they have a chance to wipe out their opponents. However, the scene that he saw after returning was very different from what he had expected. If that was the case, what should he do? Qin Mingho, immediately go to the foot of the mountain to help fix the hole. Baldi, go gather the men and prepare to counterattack. Li Fengmu ordered. The two of them received the order and went to do their own things. Sword masterly, don't worry. Xiao Gongzhu disrupted the plan because he had no other choice. After all, no one would have thought that the White Bear tribe would charge out like crazy. If Master Xiao didn't take action, we might not be able to stop them. Ji Fei explained patiently. However, Li Fengmu waved his hand nonchalantly. He was clear about this point. If the situation hadn't changed, Xiaoyang wouldn't have taken action so easily. Moreover, in a battle formation, it was more of a test of one's ability to adapt. If everything remained the same, what was the difference between them and a machine? Moreover, with such a defense, they would probably lose the defense in the end. Li Fengmu trusted that young man quite a bit. However, what made him uncomfortable now was what he should do. Or rather, how should he cooperate with Xiaoyang? Even Li Fengmu could tell that the young man was purposely showing weakness in the battle with Bai Cheng. He probably already had many plans in his mind. Therefore, if Li Fengmu acted rashly, it would be very easy to break the current situation. In fact, it was even possible for the overall situation to change completely. Because of this, Li Fengmu had to be even more careful. Swordsman Li, you can wait for a while. When Qin Wang and Princess Mingzhu arrive, you can rush out and catch them off guard. Ji Fei smiled. Li Fengmu smiled and nodded. If that was the case, it would indeed work. However, he did not know how far the battle had progressed and how long it would take for them to arrive. Of course, Li Fengmu wasn't anxious at all, because since Xiaoyang could show weakness under the premise of protecting himself, it could be seen that everything was still under control and there was no need to worry. Right now, Xiaoyang was indeed pretending to be weak. In fact, he was acting very naturally in many places. Facing the encirclement of Bai Cheng and 2/3 order Martial King experts, Huang Xiaolong was battered and exhausted. However, every time he dodged, it was just right. No matter how fierce their attacks were, the damage he suffered was always the least. As the battle progressed, Bai Cheng became more and more certain that Xiaoyang was indeed an arrow at the end of its flight. Even when dealing with the attacks, he seemed to be somewhat powerless. Therefore, this was a great opportunity to kill him. He definitely couldn't let him live past today. On the contrary, Bai Yuan felt that this matter was somewhat abnormal. Previously, Xiaoyang's attacks were so overbearing, but in this battle he was always at a disadvantage and defending. Even his attacks were weak and powerless. Since Xiaoyang could repel so many attacks and even kill Bai Wuxi, there was no need to doubt his strength. Therefore, now he was obviously a weak 3rd order martial king, which made people feel that something was wrong. Even if Xiaoyang had just broken through to 3rd order martial king, his battle record didn't allow him to be a weak 3rd order martial king. Bai Liduan didn't think so much, and the killing moves in his hands were more frequent. Now he couldn't wait to smash Xiaoyang into pieces. As long as he could kill him, it would be a great contribution. Therefore, how could he miss such a great opportunity? Moreover, the battle merits that he could obtain would definitely be a unique existence. However, although Bai Liduin was dauntless and even used many of his special skills, the effect was pitifully small. This feeling of being unable to exert strength almost made Bai Liduin collapse, and the anger in his heart was accumulating more and more. On the other hand, Bai Cheng became braver as the battle went on. He had always been good at bullying the weak and fearing the strong. Xiao Yang was still pretending, and at the same time he was waiting for an opportunity. As long as Bai Cheng showed the slightest flaw, his time of death would come. Now, Bai Cheng could be said to have reached the point of muddle-headedness. In addition, he was used to acting arbitrarily in the clan, and he didn't listen to the opinions of others. This made him feel that no matter what, everything would go according to his ideas. It was whimsical. On top of a small mountain, 3 warriors in golden armor stood there proudly, looking very proud. This was especially true for the leader, whose golden armor was dyed red with blood. Below their feet were a few white bear corpses. After a round of fighting, Qin Wang led Xin Wushuang and Xin Luo to successfully annihilate this small team. However, they did not expect that the strength of this team would be so strong. They had almost all died in this place. "How are you guys?" Qin Wang asked. Although Qin Wang was severely injured, his mind was still on the main battlefield. After all, that was his battlefield. As for this place, it was just an appetizer. "I'm fine. I can continue fighting," Xin Wushuang said with a trembling voice after he calmed his aura. None of the 3 of them had it easy in this tough battle. However, they had all survived. That was extremely fortunate. "I'm fine too," Xin Luo said after taking a deep breath. They said it casually, but it looked like they were struggling. "Since that's the case, let's hurry back." Emperor Qin laughed out loud and took out a few bottles of pills. One could say that the journey back was their only chance to heal and recover. Chapter 2372. Although the situation at the foot of Pin Victory Mountain was not worrisome, and the White Bear tribe seemed to have the upper hand, however, they were unable to gain anything substantial. For example, Bai Cheng led 2 martial emperors to encircle Xiaoyang. Although they seemed to have perfectly suppressed him, they were unable to cause any substantial damage to him. On the other hand, the attacks from the other side were also very fierce, as if they were unparalleled. However, other than tearing some small gaps at the foot of the mountain, they were unable to make any further progress. Moreover, those small gaps were guarded by martial emperors, and with the support from the top of the mountain, it was impossible for them to attack. Therefore, the current situation was like a tug-of-war, to see who would be able to last until the end. The White Bear tribe's beastly nature had been completely aroused, and they were bravely fighting without caring about their own lives. Otherwise, any calmer general would have realized that this situation was very unfavorable to him. After all, they were fighting away from home. Even if the elites of the 4-realm alliance were here, no one could say when the reinforcements would arrive. Moreover, the core of the 4-realm alliance was very simple, and that was to defend their own place before the final battle. As for other things, although they needed to consider, they did not necessarily need to implement them. Therefore, the 2 sides seemed to have entered a stalemate, and no one could do anything to the other. This was an extreme test of patience. On top of Pin Victory Mountain, Li Fengmu was still observing. This was because he did not dare to act rashly. As the person in the final battle, he needed to maintain his peak condition. Otherwise, once he joined the battle, his strength would be severely depleted, and he would not be able to continue until the final battle. Not to mention whether he would be able to obtain more rewards. When the time comes, he would not be able to pursue and kill. That would be the most unbearable situation. Therefore, all the pressure fell on the people who were supposed to stay behind. The attacks they were facing were very fierce, especially Ji Fei. In this short period of time, he was almost exhausted, as if he could collapse at any time. Fortunately, Ji Fei had stayed in the tomb of the gods for thousands of years, and his patience was extraordinary. Therefore, he could continue to persevere. If it was someone else, they would have been defeated long ago. Now, after dozens of rounds, Bai Cheng's heart began to become anxious. This was because he had previously discovered that Xiaoyang was just an empty shell. However, he had been able to hold on for so long. This also made people wonder what was going on. Some thoughts were quickly dispelled. After all, under such circumstances, what reason did he have to lose? Everything seemed to be predestined. The suppression in terms of strength was not something that could be easily wiped out. Moreover, they only needed to calm down a little, and then many problems would naturally be solved. After a long battle, Xiaoyang also began to discover the flaws of these three people. However, who to kill first had become a difficult problem. Although Xiaoyang's goal had always been clear, which was to kill Bai Cheng, Xiaoyang's goal had always been clear. However, to kill a fourth-order martial king expert was not an easy task. Coupled with the fact that Bai Cheng was a person who would flee in fear at the slightest movement, he was an existence that was even more difficult to kill. Therefore, it was necessary to kill him in one blow. It could even be said that Xiaoyang only had one chance to attack. If he missed it, it would be difficult to control the future. Therefore, he felt a headache coming on as to how he was going to do this. At least, in terms of the layout, there could not be any mistakes. Xiaoyang had no choice but to think about it carefully. He didn't want to see even the slightest mistake. "Ancestor, be careful!" Bai Yuan suddenly shouted. Bai Cheng couldn't help but be startled when he heard this. However, he didn't sense any danger. His eyes became a lot colder. Xiaoyang has been pretending to be weak. I think he already has a plan in mind. Bai Yuan reminded him again. Bai Yuan was also a little afraid of the ancestor's misunderstanding. However, he was more afraid that the ancestor would die in the hands of Xiaoyang. Once the ancestor died in battle, it would be a fatal blow to the White Bear tribe. Even the army's morale would fall to the bottom of the valley because of this. If the ancestor was killed by Xiaoyang, then who could stop him? When the time comes, they would be called lambs waiting to be slaughtered. That would not be overboard. Bai Cheng was not very happy with such a reminder. He even felt that it was a complete disdain for him. On the other hand, Xiaoyang had to be careful. This Bai Yuan was indeed a little smart. It seemed that he had to find a chance to defeat him. However, looking at Bai Cheng's arrogant look, Xiaoyang changed his mind. Since this person turned a blind eye to the warning, it meant that his death was imminent. After the slash, Xiaoyang quickly distanced himself. At the same time, he stood there panting. "Kid, we merely warmed up. I did not expect you to be so exhausted." Bai Cheng laughed. Now, Bai Cheng finally saw the opportunity to win. Moreover, he felt that the overall situation could be settled. He originally thought that this kid was very powerful, but now it seemed that he was just SOSO. As for the previous deeds, they were probably done by the woman, and he had replaced her. Based on the battle between the two of them, Bai Cheng felt that Xiaoyang was much weaker than the woman. Furthermore, the disparity between them was not an ordinary kind of disparity. If Xiaoyang was really as powerful as the rumors said, why would he stay in Taste Victory Mountain instead of exterminating the other teams with the woman? Therefore, from this situation, Bai Cheng analyzed many possibilities. What he was most certain of was that possibility. Bai Yuan was still very vigilant. His ancestor was so arrogant and underestimating the enemy, which made him feel helpless. However, what could he do now that things had come to this? Therefore, no matter how unwilling and unhappy he was, there was nothing he could do. The only thing he could do was to guard as much as possible. Bai Liduan stood on the other side, ready to launch a sneak attack to end Xiaoyang's life. At this moment, Xiaoyang coldly snickered. He swung the sword in his hand. Instantly, an overbearing aura rushed out. Bai Yuan's expression suddenly turned serious. As expected, he was just pretending to be weak. Lightning Prison Fire. Chapter 2373. In an instant, the sound of thunder suddenly resounded beside Bai Cheng. In the beginning, Bai Cheng did not pay much attention to it. After all, to them, lightning was a natural talent. Moreover, they used the power of lightning more often in battle. However, in the next moment, Bai Cheng's expression changed drastically. This was because he realized that there was something strange about the lightning around him. This power did not belong to him, Bai Yuan or Bai Liduan. It belonged to Xiaoyang. From the beginning, Xiaoyang had already planned this out. Previously, he had pretended to be weak in order to set up this trap, so that Bai Cheng would not notice the minute changes when he was careless. This was to set the stage and decide the outcome of the battle. Now, it could be said that everything had changed. Although it was not the best time to kill Bai Cheng, he had to do it. After all, Bai Yuan had already noticed something. If he continued to show weakness, Bai Yuan would be even more suspicious. If he were to discover any more strange things, he was afraid that his arrangements would be for naught. Success or failure, it all depended on this sword. This was a sword that he had no choice but to use. Bai Cheng suddenly frowned. He did not expect Xiaoyang to be so scheming. He could even come up with such a plan. Bai Cheng's heart was filled with self-blame. How could he be so confident? Now he was also very confident. Even with the difference in cultivation level, he could still fight. Therefore, there was no point in worrying. Good lad. I didn't expect you to hide it so well. However, it's useless. Bai Cheng shouted angrily. Suddenly, a powerful force exploded from his body. Immediately, the two forces collided and killed each other. The corners of Xiaoyang's mouth curled up slightly. He could only say, "It's too late for that." Bai Cheng's actions were too late. What's the point of all this if it's so easy for you to break the trap that we've set up? Kill! Xiaoyang shouted in a low voice. He immediately thrust out his sword and rushed towards Bai Cheng. Immediately, the Thunderfire Divine sword was covered in a layer of flames. Countless sword auras formed around it. At that very moment, its power had reached its peak. Bailey Dunn, who stood at the side, couldn't help but feel terrified. He could sense that if he was targeted by this sword, he would probably die without a doubt. Now that he thought about it, the methods he had used before seemed fierce, but they were just useless. They were useless. This human cultivator was too good at concealing his strength. Who would have thought that the killer move had already been set up and was just waiting for them to enter? Bai Cheng's first reaction was to escape, but the Thunder Prison had already arrived and trapped him within. It was impossible for him to escape. Break! Bai Cheng continued to roar. His huge true form continued to bombard the Thunder Prison. Thunderbolts shot out one after another, clashing with the power of the Thunder Prison. Of course, a fourth-order Martial King was not just for show. After a few punches, the Thunder Prison was already on the verge of collapse. However, Xiaoyang's sword had already arrived. Boundless lightning. At that moment, Bai Yuan stepped forward and stood in front of Bai Cheng. He wanted to use his true strength to block the sword. Among the White Bear clan, Bai Yuan was the only one with the clearest mind. Bai Yuan's thoughts were very clear. If their patriarch was defeated, it would be a crushing defeat. Therefore, no matter what, he had to block the sword. At that moment, Bai Yuan poured out all the power in his body. He wanted to block the opponent and buy time for his patriarch. However, he still underestimated Xiaoyang's strength and ferocity. Xiaoyang allowed the thunderbolts to bombard his body, but in the end he was still indifferent. It was as if the thunderbolts couldn't cause any substantial damage to him. It was very powerful. Countless flaming sword auras arrived first. Even though Bai Yuan's skin was very tough, his skin was instantly torn open. The huge white bear endured the pain, but his entire body was covered by the scorching pain. He couldn't help but tremble. In the blink of an eye, Xiaoyang had already arrived. The sword directly pierced through Bai Yuan's body. Xiaoyang stopped in front of Bai Yuan. He stared at the muscular man in front of him and couldn't help but frown. "I didn't expect the White Bear tribe to have such a hero like you," Xiaoyang said with a bitter smile. From the White Bear tribe's divine souls, Xiaoyang obtained more information about selfishness. However, there was almost no one like Bai Yuan who would sacrifice his own life for the greater good. Therefore, Xiaoyang was very surprised by Bai Yuan's actions. At the same time, he respected such a person. Bai Yuan wanted to speak, but when he opened his mouth, only blood flowed out from the corner of his mouth. After the Thunderfire divine sword pierced through Bai Yuan's body, it continued forward and pierced Bai Cheng's chest. Unfortunately, most of the force was absorbed by Bai Yuan, so Bai Cheng didn't die. However, he definitely wasn't in a good state now. It was supposed to be a killing blow, but it killed the wrong person. Bai Li Duin, who was standing at the side, didn't dare to move. Because of the sudden change of events, he was almost scared out of his wits. Bai Li Duin couldn't understand how Xiaoyang could be so powerful. They were both third-level martial emperors, but the difference in strength between them was like heaven and earth. The corner of Bai Yuan's mouth twitched. He wanted to attack with all his might to push the young man back, but he realized that he didn't even have the strength to raise his hand. The might of this sword strike was so terrifying. It burned all the internal organs in his body, and it was even to the extent that his meridians were affected as well, causing him to be unable to move in the slightest. Xiaoyang looked at the white bear in front of him and couldn't help but feel sad. Such a hero shouldn't die here. However, in the face of war, if you showed mercy to your enemy, it would be cruel to your own world. So what if he let him go today? When the time comes, when they come back, they won't show any mercy. Therefore, Xiaoyang was very clear about this. Bai Yuan shook his head. He felt that his life force was quickly draining away. Even though his heart was filled with unwillingness, he could only endure it. No matter how many thoughts he had, they were all gone now. In the end, Bai Yuan couldn't hold on anymore and fell to the ground. Seeing this respectable person fall, Xiaoyang silently sighed. He raised his eyes and looked at Bai Cheng. If Bai Cheng didn't die, the war between the Flowing Cloud Boundary and the White Bear tribe wouldn't end. Chapter 2374. At this moment, Bai Cheng had already pulled out the Thunder-Fire Divine sword from his body and threw it on the ground. When he saw Xiaoyang's eyes staring at him, his heart couldn't help but tremble. Now, Bai Cheng was sure that Xiaoyang had pretended to be weak just for that one attack. What he did was exactly what Bai Yuan had said. He pretended to be weak so that he could finish the killing blow. At that moment, the ancestor was filled with regret. If he had listened to Bai Yuan, he wouldn't have ended up like this. At least, he wouldn't have been severely injured if he was more prepared. However, there was no point in regretting it now. Bai Yuan had already lost his life. Even if he continued the stalemate, it would be meaningless. As for Bai Yuan's death, Bai Cheng only felt that it was a pity. In his memory, he only felt that Bai Yuan was a good junior and a pillar of the sect. However, that was all. No matter how strong or smart Bai Yuan was, he was still far from Bai Wuxi. In other words, in the ancestor's heart, there was only Bai Wuxi. Ever since Bai Wuxi had died in battle, his own life was the most important thing to him. Bai Cheng looked at the wound on his chest and then looked at Xiaoyang, who was ready to attack. He was in a dilemma. He didn't know if he should continue fighting. If he continued fighting, he had the ability to do so. However, how would he end up? Moreover, the patriarch also felt the tyrannical, killing intent. If he continued to fight, he might really die. If he waited for the woman to come back, he would definitely die. The more he thought about it, the more terrified the ancestor became. He was truly afraid now. He was afraid that if he died here, his tens of thousands of years of cultivation would disappear. He didn't want to die yet. He wanted to go higher and see more scenery. Bai Li Duin was scared out of his wits. He didn't think that he was stronger than Bai Yuan. Furthermore, Xiaoyang could even scheme against Elder Ancestor Bai, let alone Elder Ancestor Bai. Li Fengmu, who was watching the battle from a high vantage point, couldn't help but twitch his mouth. They all knew that Xiaoyang was very strong, but they didn't know that his strength was already amazing. This kind of leapfrogging challenge seemed to be a piece of cake. In fact, he didn't even seem to have expended much effort. This was the most terrifying point. Xiao Yang was not only strong, but he was also not weak in terms of scheming. If you underestimate him, I'm afraid you'll pay the price for it. In fact, when you are not alert, you are already following his rhythm. Zhao Wang subconsciously sucked in a breath of cold air. Even though he had a grudge with Xiaoyang, he had no choice but to admit that the latter's strength was truly admirable. If he was here to guard the door to the God Realm, it would be absolutely safe. Thinking of these things, some of the knots in King Zhao's heart were untied. In the end, it was only a dispute between the younger generation. Perhaps even they themselves had already forgotten about it, so why should he take it to heart? As expected of someone who is comparable to Princess Mingzhu, the old Prime Minister exclaimed. Now, the old Prime Minister also realized how stupid it was for him to use Wei Beixin to test Xiaoyang back then. Moreover, the old Prime Minister had wanted to kill him back then. Otherwise, Xiaoyang might not have been so ruthless. After all, a person would have a temper. Once you provoked him, how could there be any kindness left in him? Thinking of these things, the old Prime Minister felt a headache coming on. What he had done was indeed a little unkind and dishonorable. At this moment, Qin Wang also returned with Shen Wushuang and Shen Hao. As soon as they arrived, they saw the sword. This lad is truly outstanding. His strength is truly enviable. The Qin Emperor smiled bitterly. Qin Wang had always been the representative of the God Realm's combat strength. However, everything seemed to have changed now. Not to mention his own rising star, Princess Mingzhu. Just take Li Fengmu and Luo Ji, for example. If it was a one-on-one battle, his Xinqi peak really didn't have much confidence in taking them down, and might even fall into a disadvantage. The 3,000 small worlds and 3,000 medium worlds seemed to have similar rules. But the differences between them were enough to change the trajectory of many cultivators' fates. Shen Hao's brows couldn't help but twitch slightly. This young man who had competed with him for first place back then had already reached a height that he had to look up to. Xiaoyang was already able to lead a world to fight against foreign enemies, but he still needed to train under the wings of his elders. Many of these thoughts made Shen Hao feel that his life had more or less been wasted. They even said that they would only start the final battle after we met up. I didn't think that everything would be settled by the time I arrived. Qin Wang mocked himself again. From the looks of it, the drifting cloud realm only needed Xiaoyang. Back then, Princess Mingzhu couldn't take down an expert after hundreds of rounds of hard fighting. However, he actually managed to severely injure him with a scheme. It had always been like this. A battle wasn't a competition of strength. Sometimes, using one's brain would make many things simpler and easier. A brainless battle, unless one's strength could crush the opponent, would be giving the opponent a chance to seek his own death. Bailey Dunn, what are you waiting for? Xiaoyang doesn't have much strength now. Why aren't you taking him down? What are you hesitating for? Bai Cheng suddenly shouted angrily. Bailey Dunn, who was standing at the side, finally regained his senses. He immediately turned to look at Xiaoyang. As expected, he didn't make another move after that slash. If not for his lack of confidence and strength, why would he stop? At this moment, Bailey Dunn also became restless. However, he didn't dare to act rashly. Although that was the inference, who could say for sure if Xiaoyang still had some tricks up his sleeves? If he stood there and was still scheming in his heart, what did it have to do with seeking his own death if he rushed over? However, Bailey Dunn was pressured by elder ancestor Bai and had no choice but to act. It was extremely painful. In the next moment, Bailey Dunn gritted his teeth and rushed over. However, when Xiaoyang turned around, he was so shocked that he immediately stopped and didn't dare to move an inch. The unwarranted pressure made Bailey Dunn feel that there was an abyss in front of him. If he took another step forward, he would fall into a state of eternal damnation. Bai Cheng saw that the kid was scared out of his wits and immediately turned to run. Bai Cheng was afraid of death. Even if the battle here collapsed, he wanted to live. Chapter 2375. On a wasteland, a woman stood silently in midair with a sword in her hand. Her dress was stained with a few drops of blood. There were more than 10 giant, white bear carcasses at her feet. The stench of blood filled the air. The blood that flowed out even dyed the nearby stream red. The woman had a cold expression on her face. She only heaved a sigh of relief after she confirmed that none of the carcasses were alive. Princess Mingzhu was in charge of almost half of the team in this purge operation. She had finally killed all the white bears that she needed to kill. Just as she was about to head to the main battlefield for the final battle, a badge on her waist flashed. Princess Mingzhu picked up the Pisces badge and frowned when she saw the message left on it. She was clearly displeased. "He sure is fast," Princess Mingzhu sighed. Then, with her sword in hand, she turned into a white streak of light and disappeared into the horizon. After Princess Mingzhu left, hundreds of cultivators flocked to the scene. However, they did not loot the white bears' carcasses. Instead, they cleaned them up in an orderly manner. Bai Cheng had run out of ideas. He could only run for his life. He did not care what kind of commotion his departure would cause or what kind of consequences it would cause. In fact, he did not even want to think about it. He was such a selfish person. If he saw benefits, he would run faster than anyone else. It was the same when his life was threatened. The current Bai Cheng no longer thought about his original intention of coming here. Back then, he wanted revenge, fame, and fortune, but now he had forgotten all about them as if they were no longer important to him. The most important thing was to save his own life. Bailey Dunn gulped subconsciously when he saw Ancestor by running for his life. He did not expect the war to end in such a way. Wasn't this a little too comical? As a commander, he abandoned the army and ran away alone because he was injured. Wasn't this a little too much? At this moment, Bailey Dunn also felt a great pressure. With Bai Cheng leaving like this, then he would definitely become Xiao Yang's target. Bailey Dunn had no confidence in fighting against him at all. If it wasn't for the fact that they had already fought before, he would have wanted to surrender. Everyone couldn't help but be dumbstruck as they watched Bai Cheng flee. Who would have thought that such an almighty would actually do something so embarrassing? Li Fengmu sneered. It seemed that the backbone of the myriad beast realm was just like that, not worth mentioning. Qin Wang laughed even more exaggeratedly. He felt that this method was no different from that coward. When Bai Cheng brought the army over, how arrogant was he? And now, the more pathetic he was running away, the more laughable he was. No one would have thought that this battle would end in such a comical manner. It seems that the internal conflicts of the White Bear tribe are not ordinary. Their moral quality is also very worrying. Ji Fei smiled bitterly. Originally, they thought that this would be a very intense and bitter battle, but this farce ending made them feel a little strange. Moreover, they found it hard to accept. However, Bai Cheng's escape was definitely a piece of good news for them. With his departure, the mentality of the White Bear tribe's army would definitely collapse. The White Bear tribe's warriors who did not rush to the front line naturally realized this problem. Immediately, their mentality could be said to have exploded, and they were almost in despair. Who would have thought that the elder ancestor would actually run away without any integrity? Bailey Dunn was the one who was under the most pressure. Now his every word and action could be said to be related to his life. Therefore, what choice to make next became the number one problem in his heart. If he made the wrong choice, then he would face a dead end. But he didn't want to die, he wanted to continue living. However, if he wanted to live from Xiao Yang's hands, how could that be possible? Therefore, Bailey Dunn's heart was extremely uncomfortable. He was cursing in his heart. He had never seen such a shameless elder ancestor. He had simply brought shame to the White Bear tribe. Even if he couldn't win, he would only die. In order to live, he abandoned his own tribe's disciples. Such behavior was truly despicable. Everyone, elder ancestor has already escaped. Bailey Dunn suddenly had a flash of inspiration in his mind as he shouted loudly. This shout was infused with spiritual power, and almost everyone in the Pine Victory Mountain heard it. When the White Bear tribe's warriors who were fighting heard this, they were first stunned. Then they all turned their heads, wanting to see what was going on. As expected, the elder ancestor's figure had already disappeared without a trace. Instantly, many people's hearts were covered with a layer of darkness. They never thought that such a situation would occur. Xiao Yang looked at Bailey Dunn with interest. He wanted to know what kind of struggle he would make now. As long as Bai Cheng had not left the drifting cloud boundary, then Xiao Yang would be able to catch up. The elder ancestor has been defeated. Even if we continue to fight, we will only be seeking our own deaths. The defeat of this battle is not due to you or me. Fellow clansmen, either surrender or run for your lives. Bailey Dunn sighed helplessly as he spoke. This was also the only thing that Bailey Dunn could do. It was not easy for the tribe to survive. Rather than dying here, it was better for everyone to escape and find a way to survive. After Bailey Dunn finished speaking, he turned and ran. No matter what, escaping was the most important thing. There was no need to be entangled in other matters. With the second Almighty escaping, the White Bear tribe's morale began to completely collapse at this moment. For a moment, it was like a flood, and it was out of control. Ji Fei, stay behind and guard the Pine Victory Mountain. The rest of you, chase and kill. Remember, don't step out of the drifting cloud boundary. Xiao Yang immediately ordered. Since the White Bear tribe's morale had completely collapsed, if they did not chase and kill now, they would only miss a great opportunity. No one would have thought that everything would proceed so smoothly. The original bitter battle had also changed because of Bai Cheng's escape. After this order was given, the White Bear tribe's warriors ran even faster. Xiao Yang had no interest in chasing and casually grabbed the divine sword in his hand again. In the blink of an eye, he turned into a stream of light and rushed out. Chapter 2376. As soon as Xiao Yang left, Li Fengmu, who had been restraining himself, immediately led his army to attack. Since their opponents had been defeated, now was the best time to beat them up. How could they miss this opportunity? Moreover, they would not show any mercy and would be even more ruthless. During this period of time, it could be said that the people of the Four Realms Alliance were unable to sleep because of the White Bear tribe. The war with the White Bear tribe was finally coming to an end. Therefore, they could no longer hold back the anger in their hearts. Naturally, they had to vent it out. Li Fengmu was the first to attack the 3 martial emperors who were being held back by Xiaohua. If he killed them first, the last bit of strength the White Bear tribe had left would vanish into thin air. The Emperor of Qin, who had just arrived, did not want to be left behind. He followed closely behind as if he wanted a piece of the pie. Meanwhile, Mu Yang went after Bailey Dunn, who was the only remaining rank 3 martial emperor. Since the others had been cleanly divided, they naturally had to kill the only survivor. It could be said that the only ones who could affect the outcome of the war had always been rank 3 martial emperors. As long as they killed all of them, the remaining people would not pose much of a threat to them. Luo Ji could only laugh helplessly when he saw that everyone had cleanly divided their opponents. "Looks like I can only do some menial tasks," Luo Ji said as he led his troops to begin the killing. Of course, Luo Ji was mainly targeting the martial emperors. As for the White Bear tribe warriors who were at King Wu's level, they would be used by the allied forces as practice. Martial emperors had always been in existence that destroyed the balance in war. Therefore, as long as they were all killed, no matter how deep the White Bear tribe's foundation was, it was inevitable that they would suffer a great loss. Xu Nanfeng and Xin Zhuang knew their limits. They did not participate in the killing of the martial emperors. Instead, they led their troops to attack the scattered and defeated enemy troops. War had always been cruel. Once you were defeated, you would be hunted down and killed. If the drifting cloud realm had been defeated today, the White Bear tribe's methods would have been even more cruel. Even the entire drifting cloud realm would be barren. Unrivaled God, on the other hand, charged into the formation with his golden spear and began searching for his opponent. Although there was a great battle before, he did not enjoy himself to the fullest. Therefore, he wanted to have a big battle this time to see if he could gain more. Because Ji Fei had been ordered by Xiaoyang to guard Pinxing Mountain, he could only stand at the top of the mountain and watch the murderous aura below. However, he was unable to join the battle. Of course, there were also some white bear warriors who had lost their minds and rushed to summit victory. In the end, they were killed by Ji Fei's formation. For a time, it could be said that there were endless killings at the foot of Taste Victory Mountain, and blood and fire were compatible. Although there were a few polar bear tribesmen who ran fast or were smarter, they were still hunted down. In particular, the white bears above the martial emperor realm were the focus of the hunt. It was extremely difficult for a ferocious beast of King Wu realm to advance to the martial emperor realm. Even if a portion of them were to escape, who knew how long it would take for them to grow up? If these martial emperors were still alive, it was very likely that they would be afflicted with scabies, which would cause them great suffering. The foot of Taste Victory Mountain had now turned into a living hell. Blood was splattered everywhere, and flames were everywhere. Xiaoyang constantly sensed Bai Cheng's escape route and continued to chase after him. Even if he had to chase him out of the drifting cloud realm, he had to kill him. Bai Cheng's 4th level martial emperor cultivation base was still a threat, although he was very timid and afraid of death. However, if he were to return alive, who knew what kind of storm he would stir up? Therefore, he had to kill him to prevent future troubles. Moreover, Xiaoyang also learned from Bai Wuxi's god soul that Bai Cheng was a vengeful person. If he were to let him escape, how could he let go of the humiliation he had suffered in the drifting cloud realm? Therefore, when the time came, the flowing cloud world would definitely face endless revenge. When that time came, the situation would only become worse. Therefore, killing him now was the best choice. Although Bai Cheng was injured, his fleeing speed was not slow at all. Perhaps it was because of his survival instinct that he could not wait to leave this place. It could be said that the drifting cloud realm had become Bai Cheng's nightmare. He had never thought that he would encounter so many freaks in a small world after tens of thousands of years. Moreover, each one was more ruthless than the other. It was really a strange thing. Now, Bai Cheng's heart was very uncomfortable. He did not understand why this was happening. Could it be that the 3,000 small worlds were really so heaven-defying that they cultivated people who were more powerful than the other? In the next moment, Bai Cheng felt a strong aura chasing after him from behind. He immediately frowned. Looking back, he saw Xiaoyang chasing after him. Ancestor Bai's heart was almost filled with despair. He had already admitted defeat and started to run for his life. Why was he still chasing after him? Could it be that Xiaoyang was really not afraid that Taste Victory Mountain would fall? Then, Bai Cheng could only smile helplessly. If he left, the army would probably start to collapse because they had lost their backbone. How could a bunch of stragglers and disbanded soldiers accomplish anything? Xiaoyang directly chased after him and did not care about Taste Victory Mountain's matter. This made Bai Cheng feel very helpless in his heart. He knew that Xiaoyang wanted to force him into a dead end. Xiaoyang, don't go too far. If you force me into a corner, we'll just fight to the death. Bai Cheng suddenly said angrily, being chased like this, even a clay figurine would have some anger. Therefore, Bai Cheng could not bear it anymore. Come back. What are you running for? Xiaoyang replied. Previously, Xiaoyang was still able to fight when he was besieged by them, and he even managed to kill one of them. Now it was a one-on-one fight. Xiaoyang naturally had no possibility of being afraid. Hearing such a tough answer, Bai Cheng's heart was almost filled with despair. Moreover, Bai Cheng did not dare to turn back and fight with Xiaoyang. He could only keep running. As long as he escaped from the drifting cloud world, he would be safe. Therefore, Bai Cheng only had this thought now. However, how could he escape from this place so easily? All of this. Xiaoyang had long calculated several possibilities in order to let Bai Cheng die here. Above a cloud layer, an extremely bright golden light suddenly shone. The golden light was extremely sharp and aggressive. Chapter 2377. In an instant, Bai Cheng's hair stood on end as he felt a sense of danger approaching. The chill that came from his life made his entire body tremble. Bai Cheng raised his head and looked over. He saw a golden sword light descending, and its ultimate target was his body. In an instant, Bai Cheng's mind was in turmoil. It could be said that the sky turned dark. At this moment, he finally remembered that the woman had never shown herself. He did not expect that she would ambush him here and attack him. At this moment, Bai Cheng's heart was filled with despair. He knew that this was a sure-kill situation, and he could not escape at all. At the same time, Bai Cheng's admiration for Xiaoyang grew. In this heavy calculation, it could be said that there was no gap in between, leaving him with no way out. How deep was this person's scheming to be able to design every detail so perfectly that it was difficult to avoid? This made Bai Cheng feel even more helpless. If their White Bear tribe could produce such a talent, why would they worry about not being able to prosper and become the leader of the Wanshou world? Unfortunately, everything had become a passing cloud. Their White Bear tribe had also reached the end of their road because of their unauthorized crusade against the drifting cloud world. 3 crusades had caused their tribe to lose all their elites. Now that Bai Cheng had been completely locked in place, it was impossible for him to dodge this sword. It was even to the extent that he could sense that his body was being pulled and suppressed by an indescribable force. "It seems that I am going to die here today," Bai Cheng said. For a moment, he could not help but feel sad. Bai Cheng cherished his life very much. However, this time, he was unable to save his own life. This made him feel even more helpless. However, Bai Cheng was still unwilling. He did not want to die, just like that. He wanted to live. However, he could only watch as the ray of golden sword light entered his body. The sharp, murderous aura rampaged in all directions, continuously strangling the life in his body. Such terrifying killing power made him unable to resist. Xiaoyang walked over step by step. It seemed like he didn't have much confidence in this sword. If it was not for the fact that Bai Cheng was completely dead, Xiaoyang naturally would not be at ease. Today's battle had completely destroyed the last breath of the White Bear tribe. Therefore, there was no room for any mistakes. After a short while, the golden light dissipated and Bai Cheng's body turned into a corpse that fell to the ground. Xiaoyang walked over and grabbed Bai Cheng's neck with a serious expression. "You don't trust my sword." At this moment, a woman in white walked out. After Princess Mingzhu received Xiaoyang's orders, she had been waiting here to ambush him. Unexpectedly, Bai Cheng was already severely injured. Under this sword, he was completely defenseless and could only wait for death. "Your sword strike has indeed extinguished all of this old fellow's life force, but he has a way to preserve his soul," Xiaoyang said indifferently. Hearing this, Princess Mingzhu frowned slightly. "Let's not talk about the others for now. With this old guy's temperament, I'm afraid that after his spirit escapes, he will use his tongue to manipulate the remaining forces of the White Bear tribe to invade our 4 Realms alliance. Therefore, I want his spirit to be destroyed," Xiaoyang said coldly. Princess Mingzhu nodded and said, "That's for the best." After witnessing too many killings, Princess Mingzhu also understood that sometimes mercy would only bring endless trouble to oneself. Therefore, sometimes it was best to nip it in the bud within one's control. His spirit, hidden in his physical body, felt the restriction of that power and was instantly shocked. In the blink of an eye, the hidden spirit was directly pulled out by Xiaoyang. Bai Cheng looked at Xiaoyang angrily. He originally thought that he had left a way out for himself. However, he did not expect that this young man would cut it off. At this moment, Bai Cheng also witnessed how terrifying this young man was. In the blink of an eye, everything was in his hands. Even the handling of every detail was done with extreme care. Bai Cheng was extremely regretful. Why did he provoke such a person? He could not understand, and at the same time he was in great pain. Princess Mingzhu looked at the spirit with an expressionless face. Now that the general situation had been settled, they could finally breathe a sigh of relief. At Pinxing Mountain, the battle was gradually coming to an end as all parties attacked. Even though Xiaoyang was not here, the mighty beings of the four worlds joined forces. In addition to Xiao Hua's help and Luo Ji's support, all the third-level martial emperors fell here. As for Bailey Dun, he was still being hunted because he was the first to retreat. This child Wushuang is really good on the inside. He doesn't seem to be the most outstanding in his generation, but every step he takes is extremely stable. Li Fengmu glanced at him and said. Emperor Qin nodded with a smile and said, Wushuang only has a little more Jianghu spirit than second brother. Otherwise, they would definitely be made from the same mold. Although Shan Wushuang was a blabbermouth and did not seem to know what was important most of the time, that was only because he had yet to show his steadiness. If I remember correctly, that girl should be Fian. Her swordsmanship is also not bad, Li Fengmu praised. Luo Ji nodded as well. He felt that this child's swordsmanship was indeed not bad. Moreover, to be able to receive Li Fengmu's praise, one could see how powerful he was. You guys go ahead. Anyway, I still want to continue killing a few more martial emperors to satisfy my craving, Emperor Qin said and plunged into the battle, ready to continue his massacre. Suddenly, the heavenly sword was unsheathed. Instantly, countless sword qi swept out. Li Fengmu did not want to fall behind Emperor Qin, so he raised the heavenly sword and charged forward. Luo Ji was not in a hurry to attack. Instead, he stood high in the sky and looked at the battle below. Since the two of them were now in a killing frenzy, Luo Ji naturally had to be more prudent and check for any weaknesses. Although the White Bear tribe's army had been completely routed, who knew what this beast would do in such a desperate situation? Therefore, there was nothing wrong with being a little more vigilant. Even if the top combat strength had been killed, they could not be ignored. Suddenly, Luo Ji looked sideways at the peak of the mountain. Ji Fei stood there and observed the battle. When he felt the gaze, he looked over as well. Luo Ji smiled faintly, as if he was enjoying the arrival of this victory. On the other hand, Ji Fei smiled and nodded. In between their gazes, they had already said all the words in their hearts. Chapter 2378. Great Victory! Great Victory! A brawny man in silver armor rushed into the hall and shouted excitedly. Hearing this, everyone in the hall was stunned for a moment. Soon after, everyone was in high spirits and had an indescribable joy. The war with the White Bear tribe had lasted for more than a year. The repeated invasions gave them a headache. And this time, the news of victory was what they wanted to hear. Moreover, this victory was enough to prove that even if they had ascended from the 3,000 small worlds, so what? They weren't necessarily fish on the chopping block. They could still resist. The Duke of Qin has sent word that the White Bear tribe was utterly defeated in this battle. The enemy's third-level martial emperors were almost completely wiped out. Lord Xiao is still chasing after the enemy's commander. The brawny man in silver armor was so excited that he started to stammer. After hearing this great news, the smile on King Da's face became even wider. This kind of battle report couldn't be faked. Moreover, this news came from Qin Wang. There was no need to doubt the veracity of this. Moreover, under this kind of invasion, the Four-Realm Alliance could be said to be exhausted. Even their morale had dropped a lot because of this. There were also some people who became disloyal in order to protect themselves. The great victory this time was enough to let many people see hope. In this way, they wouldn't have to worry every day. At least some of the internal voices would gradually disappear because of this victory. Perhaps this great victory would let the surrounding worlds know that the Four-Realm Alliance was not to be trifled with. Such a loud voice was enough to deter some rascals. Looks like Qin Wang and the others were right to rush to the front line. Jiang Zhongqing smiled, stroking his white beard. Jiang Zhongqing secretly heaved a sigh of relief. This was because he was very worried before. If they put all their strength in the flowing cloud realm, it was very likely that they would be unable to resist after being defeated. It was even possible that they would be destroyed because of this. However, the 3 kings and 1 minister had the same right to speak. Therefore, Jiang Zhongqing couldn't interfere. Now that they had obtained the best result, it was a great thing. In fact, Jiang Zhongqing had also imagined how this battle would turn out. He and Dawang had even tried to deduce it, but the final outcome was not very satisfactory. It could be said that the complete victory this time was also beyond their expectations. Looks like we're still lacking some spirit. Without this battle, who knows how long this war would have lasted? The king said with a bitter smile. All this while the king had believed that only after the divine emperor came out of seclusion would this war be able to come to a complete end. He didn't expect it to end so quickly. This kind of speed was truly a pleasant surprise to everyone. No matter what, this was definitely great news for the 4 Realms Alliance. Even the influence of the 4 Realm Alliance in this medium world would increase by several levels. I really can't understand Xiaoyang, Jiang Zhongqing said with a smile. All along, Xiaoyang had been the one calling for the battle. Furthermore, he was the one who made all the arrangements. Every victory was enough to show how well this young man handled these matters. Up until now, the White Bear tribe had lost many powerful figures. However, the 4 Realm Alliance didn't seem to have lost a single martial emperor expert. It wasn't strange for them to win a war. However, in the case of the weak defeating the strong, the most terrifying thing was that they didn't lose a single high-level combatant. Of course, the secret behind this was impossible to explain. Xiaoyang could control the drifting cloud realm, so he naturally knew the enemy's movements. By playing to his strengths and avoiding his weaknesses, it was easy for him to preserve his own strength. Therefore, he was able to come this far. Otherwise, in the beginning of the invasion, there would have been a few martial emperors who died. Even now, they wouldn't be able to bring out enough strength to challenge the White Bear tribe. De Wang also smiled in satisfaction. The person who contributed the most in this battle was none other than Xiaoyang. It could be said that he had killed Bai Xingyun alone. That was the beginning of the change in this battle. Otherwise, if the White Bear tribe had really concentrated their strength on a fierce attack, it would be difficult for them to defend with the strength of the summit Victory Mountain. Now, the king was very gratified. His son had a good eye. If the drifting cloud realm hadn't been part of this alliance, they would have been helpless in the face of the White Bear tribe's invasion. They wouldn't have been able to come up with a perfect plan to deal with it. Fortunately, everything went smoothly. The most difficult period had passed. However, we can't be happy too early. The king was stunned for a moment and smiled bitterly. Jiang Zhongqing also kept his mouth shut. He could also imagine that the White Bear tribe's defeat was only the beginning. On summit Victory Mountain, Qin Wang, Li Fengmu, and the other powerful figures were a little tired after killing so many powerful figures. As for the injuries on their bodies, they seemed to be unaware of them and were still laughing. In the previous battle, they had been sullen for too long. Now that they could vent their frustrations, they felt a little better. If this stalemate continued, their hearts would probably become even more uncomfortable. Sword Masterly, how many martial emperors did you kill this time? Qin Wang asked proudly. Li Fengmu wiped the blood from the corner of his mouth and said, "Not many, only 7. These words were said casually. However, during the battle, Li Fengmu's body had many more wounds. He had even almost injured his vitality. I have one more than you, haha. Qin Wang said and laughed again. Luo Ji stood to the side and didn't say anything. Instead, he stared at the battle without blinking. Even though it was already the end of the battle, and even though the enemy had lost their momentum and was utterly defeated, he didn't dare to relax in the slightest. After all, variables could appear at any time. What he needed to do was to eliminate all of those so-called variables. Now, the one who was more anxious was Ji Fei. Because he had to stay on guard, he couldn't go down the mountain to fight. Moreover, this battle was coming to an end. Even if he went down now, it wouldn't be very meaningful. There wouldn't even be any leftovers to drink. I thought the White Bear tribe's strength was terrifying. Now it seems like it's just so. Qin Wang said leisurely. Chapter 23:79. Xiao Yang did not show any mercy to Bai Cheng at all. In fact, he could be said to be ruthless as he devoured Bai Cheng's spirit right away. Xiao Yang had no choice but to do that because he wanted to obtain more information. His victory was built on the premise that he knew himself and his enemy, which was why he could advance triumphantly without any mishaps. If there was any stagnation or deviation in the information, nobody knew what kind of decision would be made, and everyone might even be dragged into the abyss. After settling everything, Xiao Yang secretly sighed a breath of relief. He lay on the ground, and his chest kept heaving up and down. He had already been seriously injured in the battle, but because the overall situation was still uncertain, he had to forcefully endure this. Now that the war was finally over, Xiao Yang could relax a little, and he would not be in an extremely tense state all the time. Moreover, it would be terrible to be in such a state. If he continued, he might end up damaging his vitality due to the mental exhaustion. Princess Mingzhu was not in a hurry to leave. Instead, she looked at the person lying on the ground. Earlier on, he was domineering and acted like a devil from hell, but now it made people feel a little sad. The complicated emotions quickly spread in Princess Mingzhu's heart. She found it strange and wanted to figure out what was going on, but she realized that she could not put her finger on it. The man in front of her seemed to have always been like this. She could not tell anything from him usually, and she even felt that he kept a low profile. However, once something happened, he would make a move without hesitation. Moreover, he would often do things that were incomprehensible but could achieve miraculous effects. For example, the first time they faced a difficult situation in the tomb of the god of sin, it was because he found a clue and was able to pretend to know something, deceiving everyone. Therefore, he was able to take action at the critical moment, instantly turning the situation around and creating a way out for them later. Such a person seemed to always be able to see everything calmly and unperturbed. At the same time, it was as if no matter what the situation was, he would be able to react calmly at the first moment. Moreover, judging from the current situation, he made the right choice every time without any mistakes. Thinking of this, Princess Mingzhu revealed a smile. With such a hero in the Four Realms Alliance, why would they fear the invasion of other worlds? Did you really kill Bai Xingyan alone? Princess Mingzhu asked. Princess Mingzhu was also puzzled. At the same time, she couldn't understand how he had done it. After all, that was a half-step stage 5 existence. At that time, Xiao Yang was merely a second-order martial king. Princess Mingzhu would be able to do the same if it was just crossing a realm. However, she knew that it would be very difficult for her to be like Xiao Yang. This was also what she couldn't understand. How did he do it? Of course. Xiao Yang smiled indifferently. Princess Mingzhu couldn't help but frown when she heard this. Since Xiao Yang had already admitted it, there was naturally no need for him to continue asking. The truth is the truth. Sometimes, even if you have doubts, it can't be changed. Moreover, if Bai Xingyan hadn't been killed, they wouldn't have been able to win the battle so smoothly. Therefore, there were many questions that didn't need to be doubted at all. Facts spoke louder than words. Everything was right in front of her eyes. It was so real that no one could refute it. How did you do it? No matter how calm Princess Mingzhu was, she still wanted to know the answer. This was because it was almost beyond her understanding of common sense. It was difficult for her to accept. When the god world was threatened with destruction, you could have done the same. Xiao Yang smiled bitterly. In the battle with Bai Xingyan, he had almost lost his life. Fortunately, he managed to hold on. That was why he was able to survive. Moreover, he had mobilized all kinds of resources and used all kinds of methods to achieve that result. In fact, if he had made a mistake in the battle might have ended with the destruction of the drifting cloud realm. Even now, the world spirit's whereabouts were still unknown. Xiaoyang had always been brooding about this. What had happened to the world spirit? Or was it too exhausted in the battle and had no choice but to go into hibernation? Regarding this, Xiaoyang was also absent-minded. He was also unable to give a reason for this. When Princess Mingzhu heard these words, her eyebrows twitched involuntarily. She glanced at the young man lying on the ground. It seemed that he was indeed in a very relaxed state and had an extremely high obsession with his own world. If such a thing really happened to him, would he also be able to erupt with such powerful strength? Princess Mingzhu kept asking herself, but she couldn't find an answer. This was because she would never know what the outcome would be until she reached that step. There were many possibilities here, and they couldn't be concluded with just a few words. Perhaps in the blink of an eye, a thought or belief could directly collapse. After stepping forward bravely and asking for death, he could be said to be a hero who was cherished by others. However, after asking for death but not dying, after facing the fear of death, could he still have the heart of a hero? Princess Mingzhu had more and more doubts in her heart about this. This was because even she didn't know what was going on. Actually, when she came to the drifting cloud realm and fought with all her might, her attitude was already clear. Although the drifting cloud realm wasn't her world, it was the barrier of the god realm. Lips and teeth were interdependent. Without lips, the teeth would be cold. Once the barrier of the god realm was gone, no matter how many arrangements they made, they would still have to face the attacks of other worlds. At that time, it was hard to say what would happen. Perhaps. Princess Mingzhu smiled bitterly and said with uncertainty, there were many possibilities here. Since she couldn't say for sure, why should she say it? At least, from the looks of it, Princess Mingzhu didn't need to worry about these problems. This was because as long as the drifting cloud realm existed, the god realm didn't need to worry about the invasion of the Wanshou realm. This was indeed a little cruel. The drifting cloud realm was like a shield. However, because of its geographical location, no one could change it. And the drifting cloud realm could be said to be the shortcut for the Wanshou realm's invasion. How could they avoid it? Chapter 2380. This victory came very quickly, but there were some small problems at the end. Although most of the main forces were annihilated at the foot of the Victory Mountain, there were still some who escaped. However, there were still some white bears who managed to escape. Some of them managed to leave the flowing cloud realm, but there were also some white bears who lost their rationality and rushed into the flowing cloud realm. Moreover, these white bears became stray dogs because of their defeat. They went berserk and did evil everywhere. Fortunately, Xiaoyang could sense every corner of the drifting cloud realm, so he quickly found all the white bears that escaped in all directions and exterminated them. Thus, all the white bears were exterminated, and the drifting cloud realm temporarily entered a state of peace. Although Xiaoyang's speed was fast enough, the losses caused by the white bears' rampage were not small. This was especially true for some towns that were not guarded by almighties. It was as if they had suffered a calamity. Corpses and severed limbs were everywhere. Once the beasts went berserk, it was impossible to predict what they would do. The things they did were even more perverse. 3 days later, everything was cleaned up, and the Four-Realm Alliance began to celebrate. Because that battle was a complete victory for the Four-Realm Alliance. It was a battle that completely destroyed the White Bear tribe. If it were not for this victory, they would have continued to have a headache. In fact, the losses would be even greater. Therefore, the current losses were nothing in comparison to the current situation. Xiaoyang was lying in the same place, listening to Sun Dishing's report. His brows were tightly knitted. This time, although they did not lose a single martial emperor, King Wu lost more than 100 Stage 9 experts. Although most of them were divine realm warriors, The drifting cloud realm lost more than half of their Stage 9 experts. Thinking of this, Xiaoyang could not help but feel heartache. If this situation continued, it would be extremely difficult for a new martial emperor to appear in the drifting cloud realm. Without King Wu at the peak, how could there be a new martial emperor? Thinking about these things, even Xiaoyang felt a little helpless. Although he invested a lot of energy, it was difficult for him to take care of everything. Moreover, it was normal for people to die in battle. No one could say for sure what kind of changes would occur. It was already not easy for the flowing cloud world to maintain its current stability. City Lord, how many sects have suffered heavy losses this time? Can we increase the compensation fund? Sun Dishing asked hesitantly. Xiaoyang waved his hand nonchalantly and said, "You can decide. There's no need to ask me." Regarding these matters, Xiaoyang had always been willing to let go of his authority. Moreover, it was impossible for him to consider everything. It was up to them to decide how to distribute the spoils. Xiaoyang wasn't worried about the two heroes of the Sun clan. They had always been cautious and conscientious. Everything they did before was for the sake of Northern Light City, but now they had set their sights on the entire flowing cloud realm. Therefore, he admired the ambition of these two people. So what if their cultivations were not high? They could still use their own abilities to convince the entire flowing cloud realm. In the future, they would become an indelible stroke in the annals of history of the flowing cloud world. I understand. However, I want to give the majority of the spoils to the God realm. A small portion will be given to the Sword Heart realm and Sun Snow realm. We will take the rest. Sun Dishing continued. Xiaoyang also nodded in agreement. He agreed with what Yi Fuqian said. Moreover, this was a brilliant move. It could be said that the God realm had contributed the most to the war with the White Bear tribe. Similarly, their losses were the greatest. Therefore, it was not a problem for them to take the majority. The Sword Heart realm and Sun Snow realm had rushed over at the critical moment. They were like charcoal in snowy weather. Therefore, they naturally had to be treated with respect. Immediately after, Sun Dishing continued to talk about the changes in the flowing cloud realm and the reforms that were going to be carried out. No matter how big or small, they were all summarized and reported one by one. Xiaoyang was also very patient. He listened to all of these things. Although Xiaoyang knew some of these things, he wanted to hear Sun Dishing's opinion. After all, the two of them were in charge of the flowing cloud realm. If their opinions were too different from his, there would be a problem. Therefore, although their opinions were different, it was not too big. Moreover, as long as what Sun Dishing did was within the rules, Xiaoyang could accept it. He would not keep harping on it. All these big and small matters were discussed for a full 4 hours before they were all settled. City Lord, I think the Wanshou realm will not let this go. Following the White Bear tribe's defeat, the pressure they will face will be even greater. Sun Dishing said worriedly. Sun Dishing's worries were not groundless. Everything could be foreseen. As long as the news of the Four-Realm Alliance was leaked with the Wanshou realm's nature, how could they let it go? Therefore, this was a very serious matter. The invasion of the Wanshou realm was inevitable. However, when it would start was a completely different matter. At this moment, Xiaoyang was also worried about this problem. After all, there were some things that could never be avoided. As for the alliance with the Inflame realm, there was still no news about it. After Nkun left, there was also no news. As for whether the Inflame realm was an enemy or a friend, it was still unclear. After all, in the Middle Realm, everyone cared more about benefits. Therefore, it was impossible for eternal allies to exist. It was more about benefits. As long as the benefits were there, no matter how many problems there were, they would pretend to be allies. Just the White Bear tribe alone forced us to use all of the Alliance's strength to achieve this great victory. When the Wanshou realm invades, it will not be as simple as just one tribe. When that time comes, what should we do? Sun Dishing said and sighed helplessly, because these things had to be faced directly. No matter how unwilling you are, you can't avoid it. After all, you could not escape with your own world. Let everyone rest for now. After I think about it, I will make arrangements." Xiao Yang rubbed his forehead and said, helplessly. Xiao Yang was at his wit's end. No matter how many tricks you had, in the face of absolute strength, they would not be able to withstand a single blow. In the face of crushing power, no matter how many preparations you had, it would only be for show. It would not be of much use.